black and still dares to talk back to the police? Who does she think she is?" the white officer shouted as he pulled over the car in the middle of the night. He rifled through her bag. He snatched her phone. He fabricated evidence. Everything. Right in front of his own body camera. He thought she would be afraid. He thought she would stay silent. But he didn't know she was a federal investigator on an undercover mission, holding a rank higher than his own police chief. And he didn't know that the system now records every trace, not to protect him, but to bury him. When justice is manipulated, honor becomes the language of the weak. What state do you live in? Is your system clean? A scorching midday sun bore down on the windless row of houses along Winford Avenue, where pristine white mansions lined up like the backbone of a neighborhood reserved exclusively for the white middle class. A silver-gray SUV stopped precisely at the red light, patiently waiting for the signal to change. Inside the car, Serena Monroe sat in the driver's seat, wearing a black button-up shirt, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. In the passenger seat was a girl about 9 years old, hair neatly tied up, reading a comic book. No music played. There was nothing to suggest they had broken the law or drawn attention. But patrol car number 43 Alpha Lima Zulu had been trailing them since 3 intersections ago. The LED lights on the patrol car flashed once, then the siren wailed. Serena checked the rearview mirror and saw 2 white officers, one older, his hand braced on his back as if tired, the other, younger, his face still showing the eagerness of a rookie. Serena rolled the window down part way, letting the air circulate. The little girl flinched, about to speak, but Serena signaled her to stay silent. Out of the car. "Papers," the older officer said, his voice not loud but sharp enough that pedestrians across the street turned to look. Serena stayed calm, reaching toward the glove compartment. "I have the right to know why I'm being stopped?" she asked. He didn't respond, stepping right up to the edge of the window. "I asked for ID, not for your mouth." A man across the street in a pharmacy pulled out his phone and started recording. A group of college students waiting at the bus stop nearby looked over. The younger officer stood a bit behind, one hand resting on his gun holster, eyes scanning. Serena handed over her license and registration, but the man didn't take them. Instead, he stepped back and slammed his palm on the hood. "Out. Now, I don't understand. Is this a traffic stop, or am I suspected of something?" Serena stayed seated, hands still on the wheel. He reached for his radio, speaking too fast for the words to be clear. The young officer opened the passenger door. Serena barely caught a glimpse of her daughter curling into herself before she was yanked violently from the car. She didn't resist, just tried to stay upright to avoid falling flat on the asphalt. The older officer shoved his hand onto her shoulder, turning Serena to face the crowd, and shouted, "Go ahead and record. This is what non-compliance looks like. I knew she didn't belong in this neighborhood the second I saw that skin color." A soft cry came from the girl in the car. The younger officer stood still, like a statue, making no move. Serena tried to glance back at her daughter. Her eyes weren't afraid, just holding something in, like a breath frozen in time. The man recording muttered, "My God, she didn't do anything." Serena was forced to turn around, her hands cuffed in cold steel. When she said, "You're being live-streamed right now," her phone was smashed against the curb, the screen splintering into shards. "You think anyone gives a damn about that stupid clip?" he barked, then bent down to inspect the trunk. The younger officer gingerly opened the driver's side door, shining his flashlight into every corner like it was all for show. A moment later, he reached beneath the passenger seat and looked up. "Boss, got something." A small plastic bag, clear, containing fine white powder, was held up in plain view. The murmurs began. The older cop turned toward the citizen's phone camera. "See that? Everything has a reason. We followed procedure. Suspect in possession of illegal substances. Thanks for the live stream." Serena said nothing more. She looked down at her shoes. Simple black flats, now dusted with dirt, scattered sand, and the footprint of the man who had dragged her out. The child in the car sobbed softly, the door now unlocked, the midday wind tossing pages of her comic book out into the street. The crowd grew larger. An old woman shook her head. They set her up, clearly. Someone else whispered, another black person? Serena was shoved into the patrol car. As the door slammed shut, the red marks around her wrists were clearly visible. The older cop walked up to the man filming, blocking the lens with his hand. Put it down. Without a warrant, this violates agency privacy. And what you just did doesn't violate anything? The man shot back, refusing to lower his phone. Before the car pulled away, Serena looked up one last time, taking in the blinding white neighborhood where she had just been ripped out of her own world for driving legally, wearing black, and having the wrong skin color. The clip cut off at the 47th second, right as the younger cop turned his face away and the older one smiled, the kind of smile you only see after crushing something that can't scream. And in those 47 seconds, America began sharing a question no one dared to answer. Who is she? The first things that struck the senses when Serena was shoved into the interrogation room were the 4 windowless walls and the suffocating stench of disinfectant. A cold metal chair sat in the center, bolted to the floor, as if to remind anyone sitting there that this was a place with no way out. The young officer said nothing, avoided her gaze, merely unlocked the cuffs to reposition her hands to the front, then locked them again to the steel bar of the chair. Serena said nothing. She sat upright, shoulders relaxed, eyes not fixed on the white wall before her, but staring straight up at the single round light bulb hanging overhead. A harsh white light beamed directly into her face, bright enough to blur features, hot enough to draw sweat to her brow. The door opened after 72 seconds of silence. The older officer stepped in, holding a file like it was a pre-written indictment. He didn't sit, just stood behind her, close enough for his breath to graze her neck. He leaned in and whispered like a snake slithering past her ear. Do you want to see your daughter in the next 10 years? Serena slowly turned her head, not panicked, not reactive. She spoke only one sentence, voice level. I want a lawyer. He chuckled, not loudly, not richly, but with the rasp of stones dropping into a metal pipe. You think a lawyer will save you? Look around. He pointed to the corner of the room. The camera's not working today. 2 floors away in the security control room, a technician stared at the monitor showing the words, Signal lost, Cam 2B. He started to report it, but a night guard patted his shoulder. Technical issue, don't get involved. Back in the interrogation room, the older officer laid the file on the table, then pulled out a pre-sipple statement form. We're recording audio, not video. If you cooperate, this stays a minor charge. Possession. 6 months in jail, 3 years of probation. You could be out in 2 for good behavior. You'll go home. You'll see your daughter. Serena didn't move. He continued, if not, we escalate. Distribution, trafficking, involving a minor, that's federal. 20 years is generous. Everything you own will be seized. Your daughter goes into the system. A full minute passed. Serena still said nothing. The officer tapped his pen on the table. They say you're stubborn. I think you just need the right threat. He opened the door. A woman walked in, plain clothes, disheveled hair, clutching an old purse. Her eyes shifted around nervously. Mrs. Linda, please, said the officer. The woman sat across from Serena. I saw her. I saw her yesterday with a man on the corner of 8th Street. I remember because I was buying medicine. She spoke like reading from a script, voice hoarse and unnatural. Serena turned to look her in the eye and didn't look away. Linda dropped her gaze. Are you willing to swear under oath? The officer asked. Yes, if I have to, she replied quietly. Thank you. That's all we need. The older officer turned to Serena. I'll include this in the file. You don't have to sign, but if you do, we'll go easy. 10 years from now, you might still be able to go back to college, if anyone would take you. Serena looked down at her wrists. The red marks from the cuffs had dug deep, but her eyes remained bright. She asked softly, What's your daughter's name? Emily. Have you ever been dragged out of a car in front of Emily? Linda froze, lips tightening, then rose and hurried out of the room. The officer said nothing, just quietly shut the door, then stepped up to the table, tapping his nails against the wood surface. Don't you see, Serena? They're ready to point fingers at you. Sign it. Don't make me find more people. Serena looked at him, then up toward the ceiling. The camera's been down for 12 minutes. Do you know that violates the MOU between the DOJ and the city's Detention Oversight Board? He stopped tapping, then laughed. So what'll you do, report me? To who? Serena leaned back in her chair, her gaze indifferent as if she were the one conducting the interrogation, not the one being questioned. I don't need to report anything. I just need to sit here and wait for the right person to review the recording. The older officer threw his pen down. You really believe someone cares? Serena smiled, for the first time since entering the room. I don't believe, I know. The door swung open. Light from the hallway spilled in. A security guard stepped inside, whispered something to the officer. His face turned pale. Serena remained seated, wrists still cuffed, back against cold steel. But her eyes burned like a torch in the room they had tried so hard to keep dark. And as he stepped outside, he knew. He knew he had said too much in a room he assumed was deaf. But silence has never protected the guilty. It is only the echo of a coming quake, and Serena was merely waiting for the wave to arrive. The interrogation room door clicked shut behind the officer, but the residue of the conversation still lingered in the air. Serena remained seated, wrist imprints from the cuffs etched deep, her gaze coated in a frosted film, cold but not emotionless. She tilted her head slightly, counting the flickers of the overhead bulb as if tuning into the frequency of an old static station. Just a few minutes later, the sound of shoes echoed down the hallway. The dry, deliberate rhythm carried no urgency, but enough weight to signal that a new act was about to enter the stage. The door swung open, this time revealing a man in a charcoal gray suit, hair slicked back, silver-framed glasses slipping slightly down his nose. He placed a leather briefcase on the table and sat across from her. No name, no handshake. I've been assigned to provide you with legal assistance, he began, his voice both polite and unsettling, like a memorized speech performed too often. Your situation is not favorable, but if you cooperate, we can resolve this quietly. I'm here to protect your rights, within reasonable limits. Serena said nothing. He continued, now pulling out a thick file, laying it flat on the table and rotating it toward her. This is a plea deal. 3 months in jail, 2 years suspended, and your record will be cleared if you remain clean for the next 5 years. Compared to the original charges, second-degree narcotics trafficking and resisting arrest with aggression, this is a generous offer. Serena looked at the document as if it were a living creature groaning from knowing it was about to be burned. Trafficking? I haven't sold anything, and I haven't even been formally charged. The attorney gave a tight-lipped smile, a smile with no teeth, trained not to betray a shred of sincerity. You're smart, I like that. But being smart doesn't always save people from this system. They'll sign, it's just a matter of time. If you don't sign first, they'll indict you without a statement, and then 3 months turn into 10 years. Serena didn't blink. Which court ordered my 40-hour detention without indictment? He hesitated a beat, then smiled again, as if she just posed a trivial riddle. You know the answer. This is an administrative holding. Pre-investigation, legal, doesn't need a court. At least not during our golden hour. So, are you a lawyer or a prosecutor? Serena asked softly, yet just firm enough to make his expression twitch. He tilted his head, tapped a finger on the table to cue his next act. I represent your interests, but I also preserve the integrity of the system. Don't push this to a place neither of us wants. Sign. Serena bowed her head, a gesture he took as a win. He leaned in, nudged the file closer. Sign here. I'll handle the rest. Serena extended her hand, slowly, but didn't take the pen. She tapped her fingertip against the table 3 times, then looked up. How many cameras are in this room? He frowned. Not relevant. It is, to me, top left. Broken, he answered too quickly, and realized it too late. Serena smirked, her eyes slicing the air like a blade. Broken, since when? before or after I was dragged from my car in front of my daughter. You're going off topic, he growled. No, I'm measuring who's directing this play. Serena leaned back again, her gaze scanning the ceiling. Ceiling rig, 12 fixed units. 3 blind spots, 2 cameras don't blink, 1 wrapped in cloth, and the entire feed from 10:41 to 10:53 this morning is missing. He said nothing. He knew she was right, and more than that, he knew she was controlling her breath not to reveal the part of herself they had tried to suffocate in that black shirt. Serena still hadn't signed. He pulled out his phone, typed a message. 1 minute later, the door opened. The older officer entered, stood behind Serena silently. The attorney cleared his throat. We'll be back. Think carefully. This isn't a place for heroes. Serena didn't respond. When the door shut again, she looked to the ceiling corner. A tiny red light blinked on. Not a camera, but a motion sensor. She closed her eyes and hailed slowly, as if logging yet another data point in a game where she wasn't a pawn, but the one setting the board. Outside the interrogation room, down the corridor to the surveillance chamber, the older officer turned to the attorney, voice sharp as rock. Has she signed yet? The man shook his head. Not yet, but she's wavering. The officer narrowed his eyes. No, she's mapping the system. Either man knew that every one of their gestures, from shifting the folder to the right to the way the attorney exhaled slightly harder than normal, was being registered, not by any camera, but by the woman still sitting inside, with the eyes of someone who had written review reports for hundreds of interrogations like this over the past 15 years. She didn't say she was innocent. She didn't beg, and she didn't sign, because in that silence, Serena Monroe was not just a suspect, she was the mirror reflecting an entire play the system thought it had mastered too well to ever be exposed. But soon they would learn they no longer controlled the script, because the protagonist had never agreed to read from theirs. Malik Turner set his coffee mug down on the old wooden table in the Epic Urban newsroom, as if it might be the last time he could do so as a free man. He wasn't a famous journalist, didn't go on air, had no deep, resonant voice, didn't craft clickbait headlines. But he was the kind of person who, if you vanished, would be the only one left flipping every system upside down just to find out where you went. 3 hours earlier, Serena had messaged him. Something's happening. If I don't text back in 2 hours, come find me. Malik waited, then called. No response. The call went straight to voicemail. It started as a worry, became a suspicion, and finally turned into a cold chill crawling down his spine when the name Serena Monroe no longer appeared in any of the city's public arrest databases. He opened the VPN, logged in through a media personnel system, using credentials he once helped repair for a security colleague from the police department, accessed the internal system using a Ghost Rank account, one he had created for quick navigation through civilian arrest warrant routes. Serena wasn't in the system. No file, no photo, no search ID. Only a single gray data line, suspended between millions of other command lines, DOJ red tag, restricted access only. Malik leaned back, pulled out a private phone and called someone in the independent oversight office. I need to know who's been detained in the past 48 hours without a public indictment. The other end of the line was silent, then replied, no one, at least on paper. Malik hung up, sat in silence for a moment. Then he re-entered the system, this time rerouting through the internal server that archived surveillance footage. The data was blank, but the access log showed an anomaly. A user with level H clearance had overwritten data tied to the tag SERN48 at exactly 1:13 p.m., the same moment the interrogation room camera reported signal lost. Malik took a screenshot and stored it across 3 separate encrypted drives. At the same time, in a secluded basement beneath the Central Police headquarters, Police Chief Holloway was holding a closed-door meeting with the crisis response team, his hair slicked back, eyes carrying a calculated disdain. He pointed at a screen where the log read, DOJ offline for a few more hours. Clean your boots before anyone starts looking down." A young officer hesitated. "But what if someone finds out she has a DOJ surveillance tag?" Holloway cut him off with an icy stare. "Then we'll blame it on technical failure. No paperwork, no records, no presence. She never existed this morning." Malik couldn't swallow that. He left the newsroom, crossed 2 blocks and headed straight to the back gate of the police department, not to cause a scene, but to confirm the anomaly. He showed his press badge, requested to speak with the Public Records Division. The officer looked at him like he had just asked about something that never existed. "We have no one named Serena Monroe in custody." Malik leaned in, voice calm and deliberate. "I'm not asking who's in custody. I'm asking who's being hidden." The officer frowned, stepped inside. 10 minutes later, 2 unidentified men appeared in the parking lot, seated in an unmarked SUV. Both stared directly at Malik. He knew the sign, off-the-record surveillance. No charges, no threats, just a shadow. But that shadow was the confirmation. Serena had touched a tier of power the public wasn't meant to know existed. He returned to the office, opened the encrypted data copies. In a rare access log, he discovered an algorithm linked to a tag labeled Fed Survioson, indicating the subject was under high-level federal surveillance, reserved only for government insiders or key witnesses. No one in the local department had the authority to assign that tag, unless ordered directly by the Department of Justice. So, who ordered Serena's arrest? Who had the power to wipe all digital history on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon without leaving a trace? Malik activated the satellite tracking system, retraced the patrol route of Unit 43 Alpha Lima Zulu, the vehicle that had pulled Serena over. That car wasn't on duty today, no schedule, but its GPS was activated at 10:36 a.m. near the western residential zone. He pulled up the map, pinpointed the car's last reported location, a defunct garage shut down the month prior. Every detail was off the grid. This wasn't just an abuse of power, it was a high-level erasure with complicity. Malik turned on the voice recorder, spoke each word with precision. "Name, Serena Monroe. Pull over at 10:36. Record signal lost from 10:43 to 1:17. DOJ surveillance tag. Red tag, active. Detained without records." Police Chief Holloway was present on the data control floor during the camera blackout, requesting a federal investigation. As he pressed save, footsteps echoed from the hallway. He turned around. 2 men in plain clothes, no name tags, headed straight for the office door, without knocking. Malik stood, shut his laptop, and slid a small hard drive into the hem of his pants. As the door swung open, he smiled. "Sorry, I'm on the phone with my lawyer. Do you have a warrant?" The man on the left lifted his sleeve slightly, revealing a strange tattoo. Not a police insignia, but a military cipher code Serena had once explained during a civil system breach seminar. Malik understood instantly. This battle was no longer local, and if Serena was still silent, somewhere unseen, then it would be the system logs and those dead cameras now awakening that would ignite the war between truth and the machinery built to bury it at all costs. The call came in at 2:03 p.m. No caller ID, no area code. On Police Chief Holloway's computer screen, a message flashed. "Incoming call, priority override, Fed level." He stared at the screen, hesitated for a second, then clicked to accept. No video appeared, just a voice, a woman's, slow, steady, as if reading each word from a verdict handwritten in cold ink. "You think you're dealing with a pawn, but that's the queen, and you just did something irreversible." Holloway straightened from his chair, chin raised, his voice grating as if trying to assert defiance against a shadow. "I don't fear faceless threats here. I am the law." The voice on the other end laughed. Not a sharp laugh, not even mocking. It was the kind of sound that makes someone instinctively place a hand on their neck, sensing a chill even in a sealed room. "He just touched a surveillance tag with level 9 clearance. Any file involving a red-marked subject is automatically audited by 3 independent systems, and right now, all 3 are sending queries to your headquarters. A beep echoed. An email popped up on Holloway's screen from fed.audit@doj.gov. Subject: Request for report on arrest of Serena Monroe. Authority code D9/U-Spec clearance. He stared at the screen, as if realizing the wall in front of him was actually a mirror, and his full reflection had just been exposed. He slammed the table, shut down all peripherals, locked the internal network. No one accesses the dispatch room data except the security clearance team. A staffer gave him a stunned look. Chief, the DOJ is directly requesting data. If we don't respond, it will— There is no will. There is only must not happen, Holloway hissed. I want every handwritten document gone in 10 minutes. Check all printers. Not a single draft with Monroe's name must remain. He turned to the security unit. Whoever has opened her file, I want a list, timestamps, devices, locations. Downstairs, 2 officers frantically shoved torn, quartered documents into office trash bins, but one form remained jammed in printer number 4. The bold red heading, Special, Operative, DOJ, retention subject had not finished printing. Holloway stormed out of the conference room, yelling into the phone. What is this? Who issued a D9 clearance for her? What is she, an undercover agent? A coordinator? Or some pawn inflated by those media clowns? The woman's voice returned, this time no longer even, but razor sharp. She is no pawn. She's a player, and you just placed your entire unit on a Tier 3 internal security investigation list. Congratulations. The call ended. No click, no echo. The screen returned to a static gray. Holloway stood, frozen. A bead of sweat rolled down his neck. Not from heat, but from the realization that no one issues a warning like that without the power to enforce it. He snatched up the internal radio and barked orders, his tone colder than steel. Lock down all printers. Switch backup servers to offline mode. Erase all data with the name Monroe. Reflash the firmware on every hard drive that handled her files. And find out who was the first to say her name on the air. An old technician stepped into the room, his face drained of color. Chief, the backup system flagged a checksum error. A ghost image is being sent out through a secondary server. Not from us. Holloway roared, Who sent it? Unconfirmed. But the login credentials match. A ghost rank account. The room went still. Holloway's throat locked. Then he whispered, That journalist. The woman's voice came back, this time from another computer inside the dispatch center. No call had been placed. No mic had been opened. Yet the system played her words as if she had been there all along, simply waiting for the right moment to speak. You think this system belongs to you, but you forgot. Systems remember, and this time, it's not choosing silence. A map appeared on the screen, showing the movement path of Patrol Car 43 Alpha Lima Zulu, overlaid on a grid of Federal Tactical Agent operations. Serena Monroe's name lit up in a red box, beside the label Alpha Mite, Priority Handler DOJ/JCS clearance. Holloway didn't scream anymore. He sank into his chair, eyes wide, as if watching his entire career not just burn, but peel away, layer by layer, right before his eyes. And the only thing he managed to say, in the final paper-thin gasp of fabricated authority, was, "Shut it all down. Kill the power." But it was already too late, because what he tried to bury was exactly what had begun to rise, dragging the entire system up with it. And Serena still hadn't said a word. She didn't need to, because the moment Holloway hit the button to detain her, he had signed the indictment for himself with a digital signature he never even knew existed, across every system he once believed he controlled. Archive room number 3. Located in the internal surveillance floor where lights only existed to serve motion sensors, suddenly lit up for a brief moment as Officer Eliza Hart scanned her access card twice in quick succession. She wasn't the kind of person who poked her nose where it didn't belong, but when she saw the name Serena Monroe suddenly entered into the federal-level security clearance system, only to be completely erased on the same day, Something inside her sparked, a reflex honed by years spent among records, layered in official covers and unofficial truths. Eliza wasn't a stranger to nameless faces. Unscheduled inspections or investigation orders no one dared to document. 6 months ago, when she was still an assistant supervisor in Washington, D.C., she had once seen a woman enter the Department of Justice's Cybersecurity Clearance Center, no badge, no name, only a dual-embossed mandate letter and a look powerful enough to mute every camera's audio feed and make every staff member instinctively stand straight. That day, the woman moved like a ghost, but was the only person to personally audit the high-security data access logs. Eliza never forgot how she stood in the center of the room, asking pointed questions about privilege segmentation, then walked out as if she were testing an experiment of her own. Today, when Serena's image flickered on the system, if only for a second before being wiped, Eliza recognized her. She reopened the old camera archives, filtered by date and time range, and quietly downloaded one image from the CCTV system of the DC Center. She pulled the image up on a secondary monitor, compared the jawline, the curve of the ear, and the way the woman tilted her head when inspecting the authentication board. It matched. Not the kind of match born of coincidence, a match like a fingerprint. Eliza swallowed hard. She didn't know who Serena was, but she did know that only those in a particular tier, authorized to review classified data logs without leaving a signature, were ever granted that level of clearance. She printed out a single copy of the photo, slipped it into her breast pocket. No one noticed. But as she stepped out of the archive room, the hallway lights flickered. A sound, soft, like a muffled alarm, echoed. 2 men in black shirts approached. One of them had no name tag. The other asked bluntly, "Officer Eliza Hart?" She nodded. "Please come with us to the Internal Surveillance Office. There are a few questions that need clarification." The Internal Surveillance Room wasn't built like an interrogation cell, but it was colder than any holding room she had ever seen. Frosted glass walls, a swivel chair without wheels. A motion sensor in the corner is rigged with an auxiliary camera. The interrogators didn't talk much. They only asked one question. "Why are you so interested in Serena Monroe?" Eliza blinked, didn't answer immediately. She knew one wrong sentence could shift her personnel file into review mode. But she also knew that if she told the truth, that she had once seen Serena in Washington, had been questioned by her about security access layers, had heard her point out weaknesses in the DOJ's verification system, then she herself would become the next target. So Eliza simply said, "I saw her name, and it reminded me of someone who once audited the access logs. I just wanted to be sure I wasn't mistaken." The person across from her didn't write anything down, didn't press further, only said, "Curiosity is a double-edged blade, Hart, and the Department of Analytical Operations does not require personnel who know more than they're permitted to." When she left the room, Eliza passed through the main corridor of the surveillance floor. On the central control screen, a photo ID flashed. For just a moment, she stopped, pretending to adjust her hat. That image, it was Serena, wearing a dark blazer, looking straight into the camera. Below the image was the code, DOJ/OPS/redacted. Access, dual, protected, dual-phase security. A clearance level reserved only for individuals with internal retrieval authority, those who could request backlogged access histories of other agents. Eliza inhaled deeply. All the puzzle pieces were no longer scattered. She turned and walked away, saying nothing, but her palm, drenched in sweat, clutched the photo she had printed, the image of the woman who once stood in front of a top-secret data server, Serena Monroe. No one in the building realized that while every system was scrambling to erase a trace, one person had begun to piece it all back together. Not a hacker, not a journalist, but a duty officer, someone who had once witnessed how a ghost walked through Washington without leaving a sound. But this time, perhaps, she would be the one to make the first noise. 3 hours after Eliza's conversation in the surveillance room, Serena was brought back into the interrogation chamber. No documents on the table, no fake lawyer, no attempts at de-escalation. Just Holloway standing across from her and a young officer in the back, hand already resting on his holstered weapon. The room was dead silent, like a chamber sealed for gas, waiting for ignition. Serena sat, wrists still bearing the marks of handcuffs, but her eyes were bright, icy bright, not the brightness of fear, the brightness of someone silently counting down to someone else's fall. Holloway said nothing. He slammed his hand down on the table, throwing the kind of glare that usually made the whole internal apparatus bow in fear. But Serena didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, her voice soft like wind brushing past a window pane. "You have no idea what just began, but you'll feel it when it ends." Holloway laughed, but it sounded dry, like lung dust. "What do you think you're doing here? You think a few clearance codes, a few legal scare tactics are going to make me back off?" He stepped closer, fingers tightening around the back of her chair. "I'll ask one more time. Who have you contacted? Who sent the red tag code? Who do you work for?" Serena remained silent. No strain, no defiance, just a tense silence that thickened the air around her. The young officer in the back drew his baton, stepped forward half a pace. Holloway gave a slight nod, but the officer's hand trembled, just a little, but enough to shift the entire atmosphere. Serena smirked. "What's your next move? Hit me? Then watch the footage play during tomorrow's internal hearing?" Holloway squinted. "Camera A2 is off. You have no evidence." She turned her head slightly, as if dismissing him. "Camera A2 is off, but the microphone on B1 is still recording. Take a guess where it's transmitting." At that moment, like someone had hit the reset button, the ceiling lights flickered. Power cut for 3 seconds. The hallway monitors scrambled, then returned to normal. The young officer stepped back, face pale. Holloway clenched his jaw, but the confidence in his eyes was gone. Serena tilted her head again and slowly tapped her fingers on the tabletop. "I don't need to scream, don't need to cry. I just need to sit here and wait for what you fear most to take shape," he growled, reaching for his phone. But even his personal device showed no signal. A shadow had just slithered through the internal network, not leaving footprints, not triggering alerts, but leaving one thing behind. Serena stayed seated, saying nothing more. Her hands remained folded, her gaze stayed steady, but Holloway couldn't stay still. He turned and walked toward the door, exhaling like a man fleeing from something, unclear if it was real or just something planted through words. And right then she spoke the final sentence. "My ears hear more than your mouth speaks, especially when you lie." The air in the room slid down, like glass beginning to crack. Not shattered yet, but fracturing. In the hallway outside, motion sensors began registering movement against their normal flow, not from people, but from the automated encryption systems, initiating counter-response protocols. Serena hadn't touched a thing, but every word she spoke was a delayed fuse, and those who thought they were in control had just realized they were standing inside an armory, and the trigger key wasn't in their hands. The only question left was, when will it explode? The following morning, without any announcement or official summons, Serena Monroe was transported to the city's preliminary court in a discreet, unmarked, unbadged vehicle, escorted by 4 police cars. She said nothing, didn't bow her head, showed no sign of resistance, but her eyes pierced through the bulletproof glass like a blade, slicing through every layer of false assurance the system had built to protect itself. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered early, hands raised with phones, mouths filled with questions still unanswered. Why was there no press release about the arrest? Who is that woman whose entire record has been erased? Is it true she appeared at last year's internal security conference in D.C.? A journalist from the Root couldn't hold back, live streaming from the scene. "We've received a comparison image. Serena Monroe arrested for alleged possession of contraband. Is she the same person who presented the covert agent surveillance protocols at the DOJ's Internal Investigation Summit in Washington, D.C. last year?" 2 faces appeared side by side. Similar, strikingly so. Cut back to the scene, and the signal was abruptly cut. The screen went black. Online viewers panicked. Comments flooded in. Who killed the feed? Why is no one talking about her? What the hell is going on? The atmosphere outside the courthouse shifted from curiosity to suspicion, then boiled into rage. Someone shouted, "This isn't an arrest anymore. This is a cover-up." Inside, Serena stepped out of the vehicle. She wasn't dragged, not flanked. She stepped out like someone who had chosen her moment to walk onto the stage. Her gaze swept across the police perimeter and into the crowd without flinching. Not arrogant, but enough to make everyone realize this wasn't a victim. This was someone who knew who they were before they ever opened her file. A young officer at the door instinctively bowed his head as she passed. Not ordered, not prompted, just intuition adjusting itself. The courtroom doors opened, and, in that instant, a photojournalist at the end of the hallway clicked their shutter continuously, not to capture her face, but to record each step, as if recording history itself. In the courtroom, Serena was brought to the defendant's stand. No handcuffs, no lowered gaze. The judge opened the file, his face cold as steel, but his eyes lingered long on the first page. Then he turned to the next. Again, he paused, not out of surprise, but as if weighing whether what he was reading should ever be spoken aloud. The entire courtroom fell into silence. No one stood to object, no one announced the charges, and Serena still said nothing. She simply sat, as if testing who among them had the courage to say aloud what was already undeniable. A journalist, inside the room, checked his phone, receiving a message from the editorial. "All live streams covering Serena Monroe have just been pulled from the platform. No one has posting rights anymore." He looked up, then turned to his colleague. "They are not just trying to erase a person. They are erasing a nightmare they can't contain." Out there, social media erupted like an oil spill that couldn't be stopped. The hashtag "Who is Serena Monroe" shifted into "You chose the wrong one," because now the truth didn't need confirmation. It only needed one gaze deep enough, one step steady enough, and one system afraid enough for people to understand their mistake wasn't setting the trap. It was choosing the wrong person. Serena remained silent, but the entire system was screaming for her. She still didn't appear. No status update, no statement, not even a glance into a camera lens. Yet it was precisely that absence that made every camera pivot, every word fall silent, and every voice of authority that once roared now lower its eyes to its own boots, while those who once slammed desks demanding that Serena Ford must testify immediately began to feel the spine-chilling presence of names they had once erased from files. Down the halls of the Department of Justice, a closed-door meeting was held. No press release, no flags, just original files someone had quietly removed from the system 8 months prior, now suddenly reappearing on the table, stamped in fresh red ink. "No one will sign." Another kind of silence, but this time it was the silence of those who once believed they could destroy a woman simply because she refused to lie. Special Agent Kira Lang entered the DOJ archives on Monday morning wearing a plain black suit with no badge, carrying only a stiff reassignment order signed by the Inspector General himself. But what startled the clerical staff wasn't the urgency of the task, it was the slanted handwriting scribbled in the margin. "You once called me a torchbearer. It's time I returned the favor." The handwriting was Kira's, but everyone knew who she was referring to. Serena Ford, the woman who once taught at the Federal Judicial Academy, who brought down the Iowa healthcare scandal that forced 6 state senators to resign, with just 3 public questions. Now she didn't need to speak, because someone else was using their own career to place a question mark where she left silence. The leak seemed almost intentional. An old photo, Serena presenting a medal to Kira during the Distinguished Justice Investigator of 2023 ceremony, suddenly surfaced across multiple platforms. Serena's smile in the image wasn't political. It was a quiet radiance, resolute, carrying a hard-to-pin trace of contempt, as if she had always known that sooner or later someone would be forced to face the consequences of cowardice once justified by law. But She didn't have to be the one to declare war, because the greatest lesson she left behind was not how to indict, but how to make the accusers self-destruct. No spokesperson, no legal team, no protest movement. When images of Kira Lang walking out of Sheriff Hamline's office with an overstuffed file bag began to circulate, no one knew what was inside. But hours later, 3 mid-level DOJ managers took indefinite leave without explanation. One of them had been a key witness in Serena's suspension, the same person who once said, "She's uncooperative." He was now revealed to be the official who had blocked the release of the original case files. Social media didn't have to dig deep. With a single hashtag, she never said a word, millions began replaying last year's hearings, where Serena had simply nodded without rebuttal. But her eyes, now dissected in hundreds of viral analysis videos, the articles that once quoted officials blaming Serena now include a new line. "We have been unable to verify the original files." A former CNN journalist, once publicly challenged by Serena on journalistic ethics during a closed seminar, published a 7,000-word exposé concluding with, "Perhaps she didn't need to speak, because silence is the only thing powerful enough to cleanse the lies already written too many times." The article was immediately picked up by The Atlantic, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. No one dared openly endorse Serena, but everyone was writing about her, as if merely mentioning her name had become a political act. Inside the DOJ, panic didn't erupt in screams. It played out through hastily deleted emails, mysteriously rescheduled meetings, and archive room surveillance feeds that suddenly experienced signal interruptions. Curiously, only the segments involving Serena's file scans were corrupted. But when Kira stepped into an emergency session with the Bureau of Internal Ethics Oversight, she said only one sentence before placing the file copy on the table. "This incident is why I entered the service." The statement wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, yet it made 3 people in the room immediately reach for their pens to sign a motion to reconvene the Internal Review Board. A motion they themselves had voted down just 3 months ago. Serena didn't need to be present, but every action now pointed back to one truth. Her disappearance had become her most powerful presence. In El Paso, a new mural appeared overnight. Serena from behind, one hand holding a file, the other resting on the shoulder of a young black girl. No caption, no signature, but beneath it, in jet black paint, one single line: "Justice doesn't beg for the mic. It chooses when to shut it down." The image went viral, turned into memes, stickers, avatars by hundreds of thousands, weary of power claims, shouted through tears and noise. They chose Serena because she never asked for pity. She just stood still and let others kneel. And on the other side, Sheriff Hamline, the man who once mocked her in a press conference, calling Serena a woman who doesn't know the limits of power, could no longer enter his department through the front door. The people were already there, standing silently. No placards, no chants, just standing, watching him, with the one expression he had never been able to endure, an expression not of anger, not of insult, but of those who had seen a man's truth and had nothing left to say. When silence speaks, it needs no microphone, no music, no podium. It only needs the right moment and the right person. Serena was that person. She didn't need to win to exist. She only needed the truth to reach its boundary. And once it did, those who silenced her would relearn a lesson so old they believed they'd graduated from it. Silence is not weakness. It is the final weapon of one with nothing left to prove. The crowd remained standing. No chants were needed. They weren't waiting for Serena to come out. They didn't expect her to speak, because they knew this woman had never needed to raise her voice to change a system. And when a document from the Root was published early the next morning, everything tore open like a loose stitch on a collar that had long been unraveling, but no one dared to pull. The headline bore no exclamation mark, no sensationalism, no red ink. Who was the woman behind the quietest and largest federal justice purge in U.S. history? And then, line by line, cold, exact, unrelenting, it hit a system that had always considered itself untouchable. Serena Ford A woman with no current position, no press statements, no verified social media account, was the one who had approved the suspension of 43 federal law enforcement officers in less than 9 months. No press conference, no names released, no grand speech about institutional integrity. She did it silently, so that those who once roared about professional honor had to swallow their own words, inked onto ethics reports they never thought anyone would have the courage to sign. But she had signed them, and then walked away. No one knew who she really was, until now. A leaked audio clip surfaced beneath the article. No face shown, but the voice was unmistakable, deep, steady, uninterrupted, unapologetic. "I don't need to speak. I just need the system to feel ashamed." It wasn't a declaration, it was a verdict. And when that recording played across millions of phones, computers, and Bluetooth speakers in both closed-door meetings and public spaces, no one dared call her a disgraced former agent, as they once sneered on Fox News. Because now, they understood. What she held wasn't personal power, but something that made the entire system flinch when held under scrutiny: moral authority. The names of the suspended officers were never released, but according to internal data reanalyzed by the Root, one name stood out: a man now serving as a senior aide to Senator Holloway, who was currently leading the charge to prosecute Serena for tarnishing the honor of the justice system. When that name, Ronnie G. McDunn, vanished from the Congressional Personnel Database the same day the article was published, no one said a word. But everyone understood. The man, once removed from the system, now back in politics to settle a score, had reached into the wreckage of a past he thought buried under title and influence. But the past does not decay, it sleeps, and Serena had just awakened it in the only way she knew how: silently, and letting the evidence speak. The scene at Holloway's office became the press's next focal point. The door shut for 18 hours, no one in or out, aides deleting files from servers in full view of security cameras, the press secretary refusing every question. But the real headline wasn't the panic, it was the disappearance. McDunn, the man who had mocked Serena in a closed meeting last year, calling her a sheep, pretending to be a wolf, was now gone without a trace. Empty schedule, phone number disconnected, government ID internally revoked without a public memo. He vanished as if he never existed, but everyone knew he hadn't evaporated. It was Serena who had once crossed his name out of the system, and now she had simply reminded herself without lifting a hand, only through memory. Media outlets stopped using titles when referring to her. They started using a name coined by the public: the monochrome phantom of justice. White, because she never used vulgarity or called for vengeance. Black, because everything she did happened in the shadows, never broadcast, but waited like a gavel pounding down on a bench. People began digging through old case files, tracing her fingerprints. Cases closed early, investigations resolved without public disclosure. And then they understood. Serena never left the system. She simply made the system stare at the cracks it had created, then let it collapse under its own weight. On a reimagined $10 bill by a street artist, instead of Alexander Hamilton, they printed Serena's face. Expressionless, no makeup, just eyes staring straight ahead. Below it read, "In God we trust, but she makes him nervous." The counterfeit was confiscated at a flea market in Detroit, but by week's end, over 70,000 copies had been reprinted and distributed as protest art. No one was prosecuted, because it wasn't illegal. Just like Serena's existence, not lawless, but powerful enough to make the law feel ashamed. In an MSNBC interview, former Chief Inspector of Justice Dwight Harmon, the same man who once opposed McDunn's suspension, appeared pale and uttered only one sentence. "At the time, I thought she was too cold. Now I see, I was too cowardly." No one asked him to apologize, but that sentence was clipped, shared across every social platform, not because of his regret, but because of the recognition. Serena did. She just needed to be remembered for what she had done and what she had never needed to say. She remained silent, but the system was beginning to say all the things it once refused to put on record. And this time, there would be no hearing big enough to hold the flood of rationalizations, because no one can argue with someone who doesn't prosecute through indictment, but through consequence. And Serena Ford had become the living definition of a justice that requires no voice, only impact. If Serena's silence was what kept the system sleepless, then it was her stillness that drove her enemies into utter confusion. Because silence can still be guessed at, but stillness makes every assumption meaningless. Holloway knew that well. That's why, when an internal report was interrupted due to a server synchronization error, he didn't immediately explode in anger, but sat still for 5 minutes, staring at the blank screen, as if trying to conjure the silhouette of the woman he once insisted was just a recycled myth, inflated by progressive media. But today, he was the first to speak. "We've been set up, and she's not working alone." The words echoed through the sealed meeting room of the Federal Office of Security, prompting 2 aides to look up, 3 advisors to exchange glances, and the cybersecurity director to suddenly check his own access badge. Not because Holloway had raised his voice, but because for the first time, he'd publicly admitted that there was a shadow force at play, orchestrating something beyond political or technological control. Not a force that didn't need to declare war, just tug the right link in the chain. And the first link had just snapped at the city police department. A file recovered from an old hard drive, thought to have been overwritten, was sent to the Counterintelligence Analysis Division under routine security audit. Inside, it was an email address that did not appear on any internal data map: oversight.audit@oig.gov, the official contact of the Office of the Inspector General, and the date it was sent, 1 week prior. That meant someone within the police department, right as the entire nation focused its attention on Serena, had quietly transferred an internal file to the highest oversight authority in the United States. No one knew who sent it. The account had been deactivated, but the system logged this. The attached file was titled Internal Pattern, Misconduct Suppression Protocol/Ford File Attached. The name Ford appeared in the very report that Holloway once sought to bury through media manipulation, and now it was in the hands of the federal auditors. The sender apparently was not trying to protect Serena, but walking beside her, as if every move had been pre-calculated, every trap laid in the right place, just waiting for the first foot to step in. And Holloway knew that foot was his. On his desk lay the resignation letter of Deputy Chief Ellis, scribbled in rushed, unsteady handwriting as if composed in a state of panic. But the strangeness wasn't in the wording, it was in the response attached. A printed email, only 2 lines, no subject line, no greeting. Sent directly from a federal-level secure internal address. Deputy Ellis's resignation request is temporarily denied. All withdrawals from responsibility are subject to special oversight. Verified by S. Ford. No one could explain how Serena had intervened in a deputy chief's resignation during a crisis, but everyone understood she would not allow those who once enabled and then abandoned her to simply fade away. If someone were to walk out, they would leave with a red mark on their forehead, not a document labeled voluntary. Holloway gripped the edge of the desk. His hands trembled not from rage, but because, for the first time, he understood the true nature of this game. Serena never fought to come back. She fought so that none of them could ever forget she had existed. And now, the things they once buried in the dark, each administrative decision, every edited report, every redacted testimony, were surfacing on their own, like the survival instinct of truth. No whistleblower required, no defense necessary. All it needed was someone to stand still, and Serena was doing exactly that. A series of accidents occurred simultaneously. The internal email encryption software suddenly lost access to 3 months' worth of data. The physical archive room's smoke sensors malfunctioned, triggering the fire suppression system and soaking nearly 100 unsorted document boxes. A video recording from the December hearing before Serena had been named by legal counsel vanished from the server, only to reappear 3 hours later on an anonymous YouTube account with the caption, "This is how a system slaps itself in the face." Each fracture fell into place, not loud enough to cause a storm, but precise, cold, and deliberate, like an invisible hand orchestrating the downpour from the calm center. The media grew perplexed. Mainstream outlets began limiting coverage of Serena for fear of creating a martyr effect. But the more they avoided her, the more they lost control. Independent journalists rolled out a sequence of podcasts titled Ford Files, The Woman Who Spoke in Shadows, and She Knew Too Much to Scream. And within those, a line was repeated like a warning. We don't know who's walking with her, but one thing's for sure. She's not walking alone. In the dark corridors of power, advisory groups began to splinter. One faction believed Serena was a moral leftover, incapable of making real waves. Another, quieter but sharper, began auditing their own accounts, emails, and old connections. Because they understood, those accidents weren't random. They were signals. And those signals came from a place they thought had been silenced forever. They used to joke that Serena was just a shadow, but now it was that very shadow that kept them from turning on the lights. Serena had not uttered a single word, but now those who once stood against her were speaking in her stead, not with their voices, but with their actions. Through organizational collapse, through panic etched on the faces of aides, through wiretapped phone calls, through files resurrected at the precise moment to cause the greatest damage. And Holloway, the man who once stood at the podium pointing fingers at Serena like lecturing an inferior, now muttered in an office where half the documents had been sealed, "I don't think she's walking alone." He stepped out from the ashen-gray wooden door at 9:04 in the morning, amid the gentle breeze brushing across the city square and hundreds of trembling camera lenses. No entourage of advisors, no lapel microphone. No printed statement or rehearsed slogans, just a woman in a black coat without insignia, hair tied neatly back, eyes not searching for anyone in the crowd, but piercing through each person, as if reaching the place they were trying to hide from. A presence neither loud nor flamboyant, but enough to make an entire nation hold its breath. Serena Ford stood at the press podium for 11 seconds. Not long, but long enough to divide every moment before and after into two irreconcilable worlds. Her voice rang out, not loud, not harsh, not performative, but each word fell like cold metal against the marrow of a system rotting from within. I stayed, not because I'm strong, but because if I run, who will keep you in check? She didn't turn away, nor did she wait for a response. She simply stared forward, as if the sentence wasn't a statement but a sentence. Then she stepped back inside, leaving behind a crowd stunned into a silence she had just turned into a weapon. The live stream from the scene shattered all modern media records. 12 million live viewers within 4 hours, 163,000 comments, 62,000 shared posts across social media platforms. But what perplexed the press most was that no one dared to cut even a second from those 11. No one felt confident enough to trim it, because to cut would be to dilute the truth, and to keep it intact meant admitting a woman without political power, without backing from any party, without launching a movement, could still compel the entire media complex to preserve every word as if it were an unalterable indictment. Within 48 minutes of Serena stepping away from the podium, Senator Holloway's personal accounts vanished from Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and even the internal congressional network. No explanation, no farewell post, just gone, as if he himself was trying to erase his existence from a game he once declared, "I write the laws, no one can tear them down." But the laws weren't torn. They were simply bypassed by a single question: who will keep you in check? And for the first time in his political life, Holloway realized he had no answer. His legal team, however, couldn't remain silent. In less than 12 hours, they received 73 collective notices from legal groups representing communities who had been wrongfully suspended, arbitrarily detained, or denied access to records, groups once buried at the system's bottom, now ignited by Serena like a spark, erupting back through every crack. Class action lawsuits began forming, and for the first time, Holloway's name appeared not only under political negligence, but complicity in tampering with federal legal evidence. At the same time, the FBI intervened, but this time not as a manipulated apparatus, but as a beast awakened by the very wound it thought had scarred over. A statewide record access order was issued. No explanations, no press briefings. Just one sentence sent to every local enforcement agency: we request full access to all files related to the Ford investigation, including any documents sealed, withheld, or deleted from internal systems within the past 12 months. Non-compliance will result in federal liability. The tone was cold, but the reaction spread like gunpowder catching flame. Inside a sealed conference room at the FBI's Eastern Division headquarters, an agent quietly placed a copy of Serena's speech recording on the table. He said nothing, just looked at his direct superior with an expression that said everything. She just did what we thought only the Supreme Court would dare. No one argued, no one doubted. They all understood. No one could stay on the sidelines anymore, because if they remained silent, they themselves would be the next ones asked, who will keep you in check? And none of them would be fit to answer. Within local police departments, fear no longer lay in suspension but in retroactive exposure. Emergency backup modes were activated on servers. Clerks began printing hard copies of documents once marked for deletion. Hallway cameras were quietly removed for maintenance. But everyone knew these actions only deepened the trail. Because if Serena once knew every weak spot in the system as an insider, now she didn't need to access it. She only needed to let the system panic and expose itself. A former police chief, the one whose report triggered Serena's investigation last year, was spotted by reporters leaving the state at night. When asked, "Are you afraid of being sued?" he stayed silent for a moment, then exhaled one final sentence before stepping into his car. "I won't run. You should." That sentence, strangely, became the headline of dozens of news articles the next morning, not because it was eloquent, but because the world understood. Those who once thought themselves judges were now becoming defendants, and only those still seated in the hot chair truly grasped. Serena never planned to walk away. She simply wanted to stand still, so that each person would have to look directly at the verdict they had written with their own silence. The words, "I won't run, you should," were still echoing across evening news broadcasts when an old video unexpectedly surfaced on the internal forum of the national security community, a platform accessible only to individuals with high-level clearance. It didn't come from the press. It wasn't leaked through social media. It came directly from the Federal Tactical Training Archive, where restricted seminars were stored, lessons delivered only to agents selected under classified protocol. The video was dated April 2009, a seminar on dismantling internal cover-up structures, taught by a black woman standing alone under the dim yellow lights of a rectangular briefing room. Her eyes weren't on the board, but fixed on the agents dressed in black suits, wearing stopwatch wristwatches, jotting notes at the speed of those who knew that every word in that room could shift the trajectory of their entire career. In the 8-minute, 40-second recording, Serena didn't chant slogans, didn't use complex flow charts, didn't discuss abstract ethics. She quietly held up a photo of the Memphis City landfill, where authorities had once buried illegal chemical waste under government cover, and spoke in a voice not loud but sharp enough to cut through silence. If you want to dismantle a cover-up system, don't let them see you taking out the trash. They should only see the road already clean. No one laughed. No one asked questions, because everyone understood. She wasn't talking about garbage. She was talking about how a person, with no fame, no media backing, no official power, could bring down an institutional structure that others had taken decades to build. With just one principle: you don't need to win, you only need to exist in the right place. The person who shared the video did not remain anonymous. He was the special investigator currently leading the internal inquiry tied to Serena's case, and when reporters discovered that he had once been her student in that class, all doubts were silenced. Not because he was biased, but because he knew better than anyone. No one controls Serena, not even those she once trained. Because if there's one thing the most powerful figures cannot tolerate, it's being forced to reckon with someone who chooses no side, but still compels every side to adjust their behavior because of her existence. 3 days after the videos circulated internally, A confidential FBI report was suddenly leaked. Serena had been present at state-level investigations across 4 major states over the course of 11 years, but had never left her name in any official file. She never signed reports, never appeared in group photos, never accepted medals. Yet in every one of those cases, the outcome was the same: mass personnel changes, sweeping policy overhauls, and belated apologies from state government, as if she never needed to leave a trace, because the fractures she left behind were deep enough to force the system to renew itself. Time magazine released its issue 2 days ahead of schedule. The cover was in black and white. No bold headline, no gleaming logo. Just an image of Serena, not facing the camera but looking over her shoulder into a fading shadow. Her expression is neutral. The lighting did not glorify her, but evoked one truth. This was not a woman being celebrated by the media. This was a woman who once stood and watched while the entire system set itself on fire. The line beneath, small but as sharp as a blade pressed to the throat of national dignity. The woman who watched while they burned themselves. In political circles, 2 senators who had openly criticized Serena just a week prior abruptly held press conferences announcing their resignations. No explanations, no tears, just a printed statement reading, "We withdraw because we no longer possess the capacity to lead." But inside the Beltway, the truth was well known. One of them had previously approved funding for a police department now exposed for receiving illegal contributions from a lobbying entity, evidence of which was found on a hard drive Serena had once never touched. She didn't have to touch it, and yet she suffocated every last gasp of their prestige. An internal bulletin from the Federal Oversight Bureau was distributed to all senior personnel. It consisted of just one line: no spokesperson credited. She's not a citizen, she is the system. And when a phrase like that appears in a network of memos, normally filled with nothing but code names and protocol numbers, it becomes clear that the boundary between symbol and flesh has officially dissolved. Serena was no longer a wrongfully accused former agent as the media had once painted her. She had become a framework, unarrestable, unindictable, unerasable, not because she held any office, not because she stood at any podium, not because she wielded any conventional authority, but because every authority was now being restructured around her. At a special closed-door session between Federal Investigative Division heads, an aging department chief, long regarded as staunchly conservative, suddenly spoke. "I used to teach that a system must remain stable to function, but I believe I was wrong. There are people like Ms. Ford, they don't operate the system, they purify it." No one interrupted, no one objected, because it was no longer a statement, it was an acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement, for the first time, was formally recorded in the National Archives. A citizen, if powerful enough to force power to change, ceases to be an individual. She becomes a living system. The special meeting room door on the 6th floor closed at 5:03 p.m. No cameras, no secretaries, no clerks, just 2 people. On one side, Senator Holloway, holding an emergency enforcement order, signed within 48 hours, granting authority to detain Serena under the claim of a threat to judicial security. On the other side, Serena Ford, sitting still, spine straight, one hand gently resting on a hard drive encased in anti-magnetic aluminum. No weapons, no lawyer, no words exchanged beforehand, but the air in the room thickened like dust compressed over the years, needing only a spark to ignite. Holloway sat opposite her. He smiled, a kind of smile drained of courage, the hollow remains of authority's old reflex. He placed the document onto the glass table and spoke in a monotonous tone, like a bureaucrat dismissing a junior employee. "I trust you understand why you've been summoned here." Serena did not nod. She did not interrupt. She simply stared at him, as if waiting for a thief to recite the inventory of items he was unworthy of possessing. And just as he began his second sentence, she spoke, slowly, clearly, as if each word had been sharpened years in advance. "Who dragged me into the street in front of my daughter, but now The whole country is watching you being stripped bare in a locked room." A long silence followed. No one else was there to witness it, but if they were, they would have seen Holloway's pupils contract like wires burning from within. He began to rise, but Serena calmly pushed the hard drive toward the center of the table, unhurried, unshaken, as if returning a lost item. This contains full recordings of all internal meetings over the past 2 years, full names, times, words, suggestions to erase evidence, sarcastic remarks about victims, and the clip where you called the suspension of an officer who shot a child by mistake media trash that needs to be cleaned up quickly. She didn't raise her voice, but Holloway's face drained, like a man hearing himself commit a crime on tape, because he knew Serena never spoke of what she did not already hold, and that hard drive, if accurate, was not just evidence, it was a death sentence for a political career, for a power network, for the entire code of moral pain, the ones used to sell the idea of democratic security. He sat back down, not because he wanted to, but because his legs were losing gravity. "Why now?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was the question of someone realizing he was no longer in control. And Serena replied, in a voice thin as a razor blade, "Because now there's no one left standing in front of me, only the men sitting behind a system I was trained to dismantle, bolt by bolt. No table was slammed, no files were thrown." She simply pulled a tiny memory card from her pocket, placed it beside the hard drive, and said, "This is the duplicate. It was sent to the FBI at 10 a.m. You're the last person to see it before it becomes a federal record." And with that sentence, every hallway of power Holloway had once walked seemed to collapse beneath his feet. He was no longer the one holding the law. He was now subject to it. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, intending to call legal counsel, but Serena wasn't finished. "Don't call. They already know. I just wanted to look you in the eye so you'd understand. I know I'm locked in, but you're the ones being seen." It wasn't a threat, it was a naming, a rite of indictment in a ceremony with no priest, no sanctuary, only truth and consequence. At exactly 6:12 p.m., a team of FBI agents received the device from Serena at the front lobby of the headquarters. No press, no cameras. But that very night, an urgent memo was sent to every federal office nationwide, requesting the sealing of all documentation related to Department of Justice internal meetings from March of 2023 to February of 25. No reason, no footnotes, but everyone understood. A seismic shift had just begun to rumble from a fault line they had thought buried beneath dozens of layers of containment. The next day, the media said nothing about the closed-door encounter. But during a Senate Oversight Committee hearing, Serena Ford's name was mentioned 3 times. Not alongside the word suspect as before, but now coupled with primary data source, confidential informant, individual under special legal designation per Section 30A. No one explained what Section 30A entailed, but the legal community knew. It's a provision reserved for those with a specialized role in overseeing federal internal operations, granting full protection, immunity from prosecution, and reverse authority, meaning from the moment that hard drive was handed over, Serena was no longer the one being interrogated. She had become the axis of the investigation, and Holloway, he no longer denied, no longer attacked, no longer appeared. He submitted a request for medical leave at 9:45 a.m., approved at 9:47 a.m. apace, so unusually fast it seemed as if the system itself was eager to eject him before it became too late. But too late had already arrived. For the first time in his entire political career, a woman, without slogans, without pleas, without waving banners, simply sat down, opened a device, and brought an entire empire of power to its knees. She never touched a single person, but everyone felt as though their central artery had been severed, not by a knife, but by the presence of someone who didn't need to be there to take control. Because Serena Ford didn't come for revenge. She came to return everything to its rightful place. And when truth was laid on the table, she simply rose, stepped out, and left behind the men who once thought they controlled her. Only now Do they understand? She never needed to run. They are the ones with nowhere left to go. She left that sealed room like someone who didn't need to win because she knew she had never truly lost. But what stunned the entire system wasn't the quiet way Serena exited. It was how she stepped off the board while every other piece began collapsing, as if it had all been set up long before. She didn't need to stand on any stage. She didn't need to write another report. From the moment the hard drive was placed on the table and her final words were spoken, "I know I'm locked in, but you're the ones being seen," the entire machinery of power began peeling off its own paint, exposing a rusted body that justice had never truly touched. The next morning, a mid-level police officer named Anthony Keene filed an official complaint with the Office of Federal Integrity. The complaint wasn't emotional. It wasn't an outburst. It was a systematic inventory. Dates, verbal orders, informal directives, the ways Holloway had manipulated scene reports, forced the reassignment of internal investigators, deleted meeting records, and, most importantly, issued a gag order on anyone who had contact with the Serena Ford case file. The complaint was submitted at 8:19 a.m. By 9:07, a scan had leaked onto the internal security network, and by 9:12, it was sitting on the mayor's desk. There was no explanation, no press conference, just one memo, sent directly from the mayor's office to the acting chief of police. All senior leadership within the command structure and internal coordination committee is to be temporarily suspended within 48 hours. Any refusal will result in file escalation to the Department of Justice. No one denied it. No one objected, because they all knew they weren't being investigated for their actions, but for their existence within a machine that was now too clearly rotted. And for the first time in 20 years, the power structure was no longer in control. It had been overtaken from the inside, not through force, but through the silence of someone who had once known exactly how it ran. Within the internal corridors, people began splitting like coagulated blood in a shocked body. One half submitted transfer requests to other states, citing mental health concerns, role conflict, or loss of trust in the institutional environment. The other half, mostly younger, less politically entangled staff, began holding their own meetings, forming a task force to call for a complete reassessment of the command hierarchy and to propose a reconstruction of internal response policy based on moral standards, not partisan loyalty. No one mentioned Serena's name in those meetings, but everyone understood, without her, none of them would have dared speak what had long been considered betrayal. By late afternoon, the Department of Justice issued a statement. A temporary oversight committee has been established to assume full administrative and enforcement control over the state system under special mandate, effective for 6 months. It wasn't martial law, no military, no special forces, just a group of legal scholars, analysts, auditors, and ethics experts unarmed without directives. But when they entered buildings once saturated with privilege, everyone stood, not because they were forced, but because it felt like an era had just ended, not with guns, but with a hard drive, and a woman who never screamed when dragged through the street. Serena did not appear at any press briefings afterward. She didn't send a thank you letter, didn't post a thank you for supporting me status like the media favorites often did. Yet every move she made seemed predated, like silent commands embedded within the outdated operating system of a power structure that never realized it had been hacked long ago. The press called it the Ford effect, but a veteran columnist from The Intercept captured it more truthfully. We're not breaking a woman. A woman is breaking us. Not because she sought revenge, not because she wanted to see blood spilled, but because she was the only one who had never looked away from a crack in the structure. And what terrified the system most wasn't what she said, but what she didn't. In that silence, every part of the machine, from police departments to legislative committees, from HR offices to budget review panels, was forced to hear the sound of its own fracture. No one was executed, but rows of empty seats quietly began to appear. No one was dragged into the street, but one by one, people started stepping down, not because of pressure, but because they realized they were no longer part of something worth defending. The complaints piled up. But Serena never signed a single one. She didn't need to, because those who once opposed her had begun accusing each other. Phone calls between departments were no longer about coordination, but about probing who knew what. Internal emails stopped being about cooperation and became shields. And when a system begins writing emails to protect itself rather than to function, it has already been broken, not by revolution, but by a presence too still, too deep, too real. The days following the hearing did not bring the city back to normal. It was not the calm after the storm, but rather a silence that reeked of gasoline, the kind of silence that made people certain just one more spark and everything would erupt again, this time with no one powerful enough to put out the flames. Officials began appearing in droves on television, each wearing the same twisted expression, caught somewhere between remorse and defensiveness. One man opened his speech with a voice that trembled, though clearly calculated. "On behalf of the entire system, we extend our most sincere apologies to Miss Serena M." Then he bowed his head, tears brimming in his eyes, one hand over his heart, as if a director had choreographed each detail of the act. Yet that carefully staged emotion quickly unraveled when a behind-the-scenes video leaked from the network, capturing the same man whispering into a mic moments before going on air. "Remember to emphasize sincere. The consultants say it makes forgiveness easier." That sentence became a spark, spreading through the community like a slap across every public display of remorse, igniting a wave of raw contempt among a populace already stretched taut. That same apology was repeated almost word for word by no fewer than 12 other figures, from the State Justice Department director to the Chief of Internal Affairs, as if a pre-approved script had been distributed by some anonymous PR agency. But this unanimity in performance only fueled the public's disdain. A late-night comedy show staged a parody titled Apology Template, where the lead actor merely swapped out the female character's name at the end of each identical sentence. The clip was under 2 minutes long, yet potent enough to force a state council member to shut down his social media accounts after being dubbed Mr. CT plus CL plus V alongside a broken keyboard emoji. Meanwhile, law students at Columbia University hosted a rereading of Apologies ceremony in the campus plaza, where hundreds of people stepped up to the mic one by one, reciting the false apologies in monotone voices, deliberately exposing the hollowness behind words once believed to signal redemption. Videos from the performance swept across TikTok, Instagram, and major news platforms, creating an unnamed but powerful campaign, a collective unmasking of those who once stood silent under the banner of the law. Each time a microphone switched on, each time a sweat-glazed face feigned sincerity, the hashtag #NotJustForSerena surged up the ranks of trending topics. An anonymous account, believed to be operated by a former Justice Department insider, posted a series of emails proving that several officials had voted against systemic investigative reforms just months before public outrage escalated so quickly that within 24 hours an online petition was launched demanding the suspension of every official named in the leaked documents. Ice-cold tweets began to flood the web. If she weren't Serena, would they still go on air? Or would she be just another silent body labeled unavoidable? Then came the absurd. A Homeland Security officer present at the scene when Serena was detained launched a personal live stream, sitting before a screen with reddened eyes and a trembling voice. He said, "We had no choice. We were just following orders." As he spoke, he wiped away tears with his uniform sleeve, as if his actions that day had not stemmed from personal will, but were merely reflexes within a soulless machine. But the video did not evoke sympathy. Instead, it was sliced into hundreds of mocking clips, overlaid with audio of laughter, cold, sharp, each beat landing like a whip across his hypocritical face. One TikTok account with over 3 million followers embedded the live stream into footage of Serena's arrest from that day, adding subtitles, "When you cry not for what you did, but for the power you lost." The clip went viral within 6 hours, and the officer's face became a national meme, even printed on T-shirts with the caption, "I was just following orders." But from whom? A seasoned editor at WSN stared directly into the lens after airing the live stream. So if Serena hadn't been Serena, then what? Who would have taken responsibility? A mother working the night shift was wrongly arrested? A young black student at a bus stop? A child who didn't bow his head at the right moment? She paused, her eyes piercing the screen. The issue isn't that they were wrong about Serena, it's that they've been wrong about so many, and just this once, they ran into a name that could speak. Her words were echoed by countless freelance journalists, social activists, even business leaders and artists, those who had once remained silent but now could not. A famous actor canceled all endorsement deals with an insurance firm that sponsored the State Police Association, posting a short statement, "No one plays victim better than someone dragged like an animal and still didn't scream." The remark triggered a domino effect. Multiple brands announced they were cutting ties with organizations linked to Holloway, leading one police defense fund to lose nearly 40% of its finances in just 3 days. A statewide judicial trust survey was released exactly 48 hours after the apology wave. The figures silenced even the most seasoned PR strategists. 76% of citizens said the state's justice system was no longer trustworthy. 63% said they did not feel safe when facing the police. 48% said that if given a choice, they would prefer to live under a different system, any system, as long as it was not the one that had tormented people like them. The full report spanned 200 pages, hardbound and hand-delivered to officials. But only one excerpt went viral. A quote pulled randomly from public interviews. It was the voice of a black woman living in Edgewater, a neighborhood where police misconduct occurred at least once a month. She said, simply and sharply, "They're apologizing because they picked the wrong person with power. What about the rest of us? What about those with no one to speak for them?" Her face was broadcast across television screens, her eyes not angry, not tearful, but hollow, so hollow it chilled the spine, the kind of emptiness born from no longer expecting anything at all from justice. Government PR agencies began intensifying their reassurance campaigns. They hired psychologists, bought television slots, and launched a campaign called Listening to the People, filled with images of smiling faces and warm embraces. But every time one of those ads aired, the public exploded online. People no longer believed in staged imagery. They dug up records, combed through old reports, and unearthed buried cases. Forgotten names resurfaced. Jeremiah Banks, the boy shot while buying milk. Tanya Moore, the mother of 2 assaulted over a license plate mistake. Malik Rivers, imprisoned for 14 years, simply because he shared a last name with a suspect who had no photo. None of them was Serena. They had no means to defend themselves, no communities rising in protest, no camera lights. All they had was silence. And now that silence had begun to swell into an underground current. An independent newspaper published a special issue, printing full images of the past victims with timestamps of the incidents, wrapped in a layout mimicking investigation reports, but with the conclusion sections left blank, as a biting satire of institutional negligence. The issue sold out within 3 hours, and pirated copies began appearing on the black market at 10 times the price, not for the content, but because it had become a symbol of resistance, a document not recognized by the government, but seen by the people as the only true report. At the same time, a hacker group took down the official website of the State Office of Public Relations, replacing it with a black screen bearing a single line in stark white letters. What system are you protecting? In under 10 minutes, the hashtag #WhoWritesTheLaws shot to the top of trending charts, accompanied by dozens of parody clips turning the Listening to the People ads into haunting versions. Smiling faces distorted with filters, fake laughter replaced by the sound of police sirens, and each video ending with a blank white screen and the caption, "They listen, but they don't record." Soothing campaigns were turned into shaming campaigns, From school courtyards and office corridors to legislative halls, anyone who had once stood beside Holloway or spoken in defense of the system was dragged into confrontations using old video footage. Statements once thought forgotten, now resurrected. Dubbed over, subtitled, layered with biting effects. A council member who once said, "People like Serena must understand the system is here to protect, not to be challenged," had a banner hung by students at their own university's main gate. "We don't study obedience, we study consequences." That banner was photographed and posted online, quickly becoming the background image for tens of thousands of social media accounts. A silent counterattack powerful enough to stun the entire establishment. During an emergency televised forum, a veteran commentator asked bluntly, "I want to know, why are they apologizing now? Because this time there are consequences? What about all the times there weren't? How many no one knew incidents have they survived?" Across the table, a government representative sat so silently you could hear the host tapping their pen. He didn't respond, just lowered his head. But this time, no one believed in that lowered head anymore. That evening, at a march organized by the community itself, people carried portraits of past victims, those who never had the chance to be named. No one cried, no one shouted. They simply stood, holding up photographs of faces. Beneath each photo was a line, "If they hadn't picked the wrong person, would they have been picked at all?" And in the center of the square, a 9-year-old girl held a microphone and read aloud, "I don't want to have to apologize to anyone in the future. I just don't want to be the next name." The words hit like a blade through the hearts of all who had ever defended the system, not with arguments, but with the plain and painful truth of a child forced to grow up in fear. The march did not end with fireworks or speeches, but with a deliberate act of silence. The entire crowd turned their backs to the state capitol building at the same moment, as if a whole generation had just refused to place its faith in what was supposed to be its final refuge. The scene was ignored by television stations, but live-streamed by a high school student. The clip garnered over 2 million shares within 12 hours, prompting a White House communications advisor to admit, "We need to listen more." But that admission came too late, far too late. Serena did not appear. She no longer needed to, because now her name had outgrown her. It had become a lever, a fracture, a warning. But the story was no longer hers. It now belonged to those who had once been suffocated in the dark without anyone bothering to light a flame. While media networks scrambled to contain the wave of fury, an internal memo was leaked, revealing that several senior officials had once voted against procedural reform, not due to professional disagreement, but because they feared setting a precedent that would destabilize enforcement structures. That single dry sentence was enough to make headline after headline scream, "It's not fear of being wrong, it's fear of change." A former government spokesperson, who once declared, "We did our best" in the Serena case, was tracked down online, his old photos plastered over a parody Time magazine cover, with the caption, "The face of organized uselessness." Public pressure surged to the point where he had to shut down all social media accounts, withdraw from every speaking engagement, and his wife, a university lecturer, had to file for unpaid leave after students declared they would not share a classroom with someone married to a man who thinks pain can speak in place of action. The system was disoriented, not because of a single accusation, but because of one simple truth. This time, the people were not silent, and they were asking, loudly, sharply, relentlessly, a question with no easy answer. If you're so afraid of losing your positions, then who, exactly, is running justice here? No one saw Chief Holloway leave his office that afternoon. No one heard the engine of his car start. There was no farewell, no resignation letter, no camera catching his final moment as part of the system. He simply disappeared, as if he had never existed, or as if the very system had erased him from a picture it could no longer control. And for the next 7 days, all that remained was an empty chair, the one once considered the final symbol of unshakable authority. The mayor's office issued an emergency announcement. The State Justice Department convened a special session. Every door, once sealed by red tape, began to swing open in chaos. Files, once kept classified under the label of national security, were now dragged out page by page. The media pounced, not out of curiosity, but out of bloodlust. They didn't call it a resignation. They named it for what it was: the flight of a man who knew he had lost, but lacked the courage to hear the verdict read aloud. And when cameras captured a reporter's final question to Holloway before he vanished from Washington, "Do you have anything to say to Serena M?" he responded with silence, simply placing a hand on the car door without turning back. That silence became the first drop of blood running backward toward him. Law students began reconstructing every decision he had ever approved. They reopened old cases, reversed indictments, and unraveled twisted records. Victims, once forced into silence by the system, now stepped forward in unison, clutching documents, eyes bloodshot, no longer trembling, but speaking with conviction. One among them, a woman who had lost both her children to a wrongful conviction, stood at the gates of the FBI headquarters holding a handwritten sign. "I don't want compensation. I want him to say my name, right to my face." Her image and message became a nationwide symbol of resistance, printed on thousands of posters, plastered across subway stations, and even cited during a speech in the United States Congress as a wordless reminder. This time, we will not forget. Holloway didn't take much with him: a set of forged documents, a few $1,000s in cash, and a burner phone. What he didn't carry was the memory of what he had done, but society had not forgotten, no matter how much he hoped it had. An independent journalist, once personally stripped of her credentials by Holloway during a whistleblower investigation, quietly traced his movements from a dive bar in Arizona to a gas station in El Paso, until she finally published a blurry but identifiable photo of a man in a hood buying a can of soda with the very hand that had signed her father's arrest warrant. The caption read, "He's not running from justice, he's running from memory." Under the post, hundreds didn't just share it. They added details. One reported the hotel he stayed at, another shared his license plate number, and someone anonymously uploaded a recorded call of him booking a room under a fake name, but with a voice too real to mistake. It all began to converge, not as a manhunt, but as a living indictment, authored by a society where, for the first time, justice no longer lived on paper, but in the hands of the wrong. He thought he could live as a common man, hiding in the dusty border towns near Mexico where American law held no sway. He grew a beard, wore sunglasses, and altered his voice. But he forgot one thing: when you've used power to unjustly imprison others, that same power will find its way back to you, without warning, without mercy. The FBI located him in a dilapidated motel outside Monterey, where rooms were rented by the hour, and conversations happened more with glances than words. He was sitting in a dark corner, staring at his phone screen, when the door creaked open and 3 plainclothes agents walked in, saying nothing. As the hallway light fell across their faces, he understood. No guns were drawn, no handcuffs raised, just one short sentence, spoken in cold English: "Emergency arrest warrant," signed by Senior Agent Serena. He had once signed hundreds of warrants just like it. Now, he had become the final line of a document he could no longer contest. His hand trembled as he was escorted outside, not from fear of punishment, but because he couldn't believe who had ordered the arrest. Her, the woman he had once ordered detained, the one he had thrown to the cold floor of a brightly lit room, the one he had laughed at when she invoked her right to remain silent. Serena had not fought back that day. She had only looked at him with a gaze that made him turn away. Now, that very gaze was what led him away. Not a task force, not the FBI, but the eyes of someone who didn't need to shout to silence an entire room. The image of Holloway being escorted through Houston International Airport became the defining symbol of an unnamed collapse. Those who had once called him the living wall of the law now looked away, dodging reporters, dodging their own memories. At the boarding gate, a female security officer refused to shake his hand in accordance with standard extradition protocol. She simply stepped back and put on gloves, as if touching him was touching something foul. The business class cabin, once his usual domain for confidential trips. This time there was no seat. The head flight attendant flatly refused to serve him a drink, fully aware she might be reprimanded, and said only one thing: "I don't serve men who erased other people's right to answer." The remark was recorded by a passenger sitting behind them. Within 12 hours, the clip had surpassed 5 million views and became the top headline across mainstream media and social platforms alike. The press ran a chilling headline: "The manhunt for the man who once was arrested by the book." But beneath that headline were no longer neutral commentaries. A string of legal analysts, many of whom had once collaborated with Holloway, publicly admitted fault, confessing they had been complicit through silence, and vowed not to accept any advisory roles until the entire case was tried in open court. One wrote, "He made us believe there was nothing we could do. Now we know. If you stay silent long enough, justice will knock on your door by itself." But this wasn't just justice, it was reckoning. A renowned professor who had defended Holloway's policy of pretrial detention without charge was confronted by a student in the middle of a lecture who slammed a printed arrest warrant on his podium and asked, "How much longer will you teach public ethics with his name in the curriculum?" The question went viral, not for its tone, but for the student's eyes. The same look once seen on Serena's face, now multiplying in an entirely new generation. At the federal office, Serena answered no questions from the press. She did not appear on camera, gave no speech, and no victorious expressions were captured. She merely signed the warrant, stamped it, and handed the file to the FBI. By the book, by the protocol, without a single unnecessary word. In a system once warped by those who hid behind the law, she chose to become the coldest, most emotionless part of it, so no one could call it vengeance. Many waited for her to speak. They wanted a statement, a declaration, a confirmation that this was a victory. But Serena said nothing, because this was not a victory. She didn't need to win. And she knew too well, the death of a system does not come from a bullet. It comes from the holes men like Holloway drilled into it, day by day. He lost, not because he was arrested, but because he believed he would forever stand above the rules of the very game he created. At the emergency federal hearing to approve his extradition, Holloway's defense lawyer attempted to invoke executive immunity, a clause that had helped him evade countless allegations before. But this time, no one stood up to defend him. No political alliances issued statements of support. No former colleagues testified on his behalf. Even his secretary of over 10 years refused to appear, leaving behind a single, cold memo submitted directly to the court clerk. "I used to fear him, but now I fear myself for having bowed my head too long." The seats reserved for the press weren't filled with reporters, but with former victims, people he once erased from statistics, once pushed out of justices' halls with procedures and a signature. They didn't shout, they didn't cry, they simply stared at him, their gaze frozen like a collective version of Serena's that day when an old video resurfaced showing Holloway smirking in an interview, saying, "When the law is a knife, I choose to stand at the handle." It was quickly turned into a meme with a caption edited to, "How's that working out for you, Mr. Blade?" He stood alone, stripped down at the defendant's box like a fallen monument. When asked, "Do you have anything to say for fleeing responsibility?" he only bowed his head, whispering something inaudible. But one reporter caught it with a directional mic. "I didn't think she'd survive. I didn't think she'd come back." That sentence sliced through social media like a wound, not to the system, but to the arrogance once thought invincible. Those who had once worked with him found their past statements under scrutiny. A television executive who had once praised Holloway as a man who held the law in both heart and iron hand was forced to hold a press conference apologizing after an internal employee leaked footage of him saying behind the scene, "As long as he's in that seat, justice is just theater." The hearing was no longer a legal formality. It had become an institutional funeral, where no one mourned the dead, but vented their rage at the man who had lived wrong. And in the Federal Communications Office, A young staffer pinned the arrest warrant bearing Serena's signature to the bulletin board. Not as decoration, but as a reminder. Some people don't need to be honored because they never acted for honor. Serena didn't win. She simply followed the procedure. Those who once believed the law was a shield for abuse, they lost. In silence, in a failure no one cried for. In a game they wrote the rules for, but never imagined could turn against them. The reversal did not come with a bang, but with a soft, seeping chorus, old complaints being reopened. Case files once stamped closed, reappearing on the desks of new judges, confidential meetings leaking audio recordings, including one where Holloway's own assistant whispered, "If she survives, we're dead." That recording went viral within hours across platforms, dubbed the early obituary of an entire rotten legal empire. The public needed no more explanation. They began referring to Holloway not by name, but with a cold nickname, the man who misjudged the survivor. The contempt did not come from strangers, but from those who once supported him. A former judge who had co-signed policy recommendations with Holloway publicly revoked his past signature in a video filmed from his home, saying plainly, "I used to think law was a fence, but it turns out it was a blade, and I helped him sharpen it." Several law schools removed all lecture materials citing Holloway, replacing them with a new core unit, titled The Ethical Limits of Legal Power. In the first class, students stood and read aloud the names of victims once rejected by the system under Holloway. Like a ritual, no one was allowed to forget. The video of that session spread across academic forums, and the image of young students reading out name after name without pause became a quiet nightmare for all those who had ever believed they could deny the truth with impunity. In a closed-door meeting at the office of the Supreme Prosecutor, a high-ranking official once promoted by Holloway was abandoned by his colleagues, not with words of indictment, but with one simple act. No one sat next to him. At a 30-seat table, only one chair was occupied. Silence, but heavy as an indictment. A veteran journalist on CNN said Serena's success was not that she stood up, but that she made an entire system bow down without saying a word. But Serena wasn't there to hear it. She was somewhere else, where applause no longer echoed, where there were no more spotlights, only the harsh precision of each seal stamped on a case file. And perhaps her absence itself was the loudest form of speech in an era where everything else was sold through media. No one remembers exactly who asked that question first. It just began to appear, quietly, like a caption beneath a late afternoon news report, then spread like ink bleeding through white paper. How do we ensure we never need another Serena? It wasn't a tribute. It wasn't an attempt to honor. It was a direct interrogation, cutting to the root, to the deepest place where every death in the shadows is forgotten before it's ever named. The week after Holloway was extradited, a national summit was convened in less than 48 hours. An unprecedented move in the history of the American justice system. There were no grand ceremonies, no dazzling stage. Just a cold conference room, exposed brick, harsh white lighting, and microphones waiting for the truth. No flags adorned the walls, only one bold line of text: "We failed," in silence. As that sentence flickered under the fluorescent light, a retired judge seated in the front row on the left abruptly stood up, left his file on the table, and quietly walked out. A journalist managed to capture the moment on video and uploaded it with the caption, "When silence no longer protects anyone." The video garnered over 3 million views overnight, and the opening speaker wasn't a senator, not a director of any agency. It was a high school student, a 16-year-old boy in a gray hoodie holding a microphone, his eyes unwavering. He spoke each word clearly, without dramatics. If she didn't have power, would she have survived? A question that needed no explanation, no subtitles. The room fell silent. No rebuttals followed, because everyone understood this was no longer a question about Serena. It was a question about all those who are not Serena. Those without badges, titles, or the means to survive when the system's mistakes come crashing down. Right after that question, a former clerk, once ignored during an emergency meeting 3 years ago, stood up from the audience and placed a printed binder on the wall podium, a list of incidents, whitewashed in bureaucratic language. In the center of the room, the host hesitated with the microphone. A minute passed in silence. Then, one of the organizers touched the projector, switching the large screen to a list, names of those who stayed silent when Serena was mistreated. As each name lit up, that person was asked to stand, not to apologize, but to answer one question: why the silence? From that moment on, the summit ceased to be a hearing. It became a courtroom of morality, where no one was prosecuted, yet everyone had to respond. A criminal defense lawyer seated in the front row whispered to a colleague, "We're not hearing about Serena, we're being made to face ourselves," because Serena, by refusing to become a symbol, had accidentally become a mirror, reflecting everything the system had deliberately refused to see. She said nothing. She needed to say nothing. It was that very silence that made it impossible for others to stay silent. 36 hours after the summit, a petition titled "Justice Rewritten" was launched online. Within just 1.5 days, it amassed over 3 million signatures, not because of eloquent language, but because of the urgency in a simple question: who's next if the system doesn't change? Among the signatories were police officers, prosecutors, nurses, teachers, drivers, former inmates, and veterans, because everyone understood justice's failure doesn't care about your background, and next time, the name written on the death certificate could be their own. That day's issue of the New York Times dedicated its entire front cover to one quote: "She never raised her voice, she just moved the world." Beneath it was the image of an empty chair in the hearing room, spotlighted above a single extradition order signed by Serena. No photo, no portrait, no embellishment, just an absence carved into history like a silent note, forcing the entire justice system to replay its own sound. Online, a video surfaced showing a former prosecutor denied access to an elevator in a high-rise building, while 2 young law students stood at the escalator, arms outstretched, saying, "A character note in your file is not reason enough for someone to re-enter the system." The video spread faster than expected. Her identity was uncovered within an hour, along with a statement from her former office: "We respect the personal decisions of our former employee." But no one believed such neutral language anymore, because from the moment Serena stayed silent, people learned how to read between the lines. Typical internal meetings began to be recorded and published. Experimental trials were held using algorithms to assess implicit bias in sentencing. Police academies were required to add 360 hours of professional ethics training, including a mandatory module, The Case of Serena M., not to teach how to avoid mistakes, but to learn how to listen even when the other person says nothing. A justice professor at UCLA said during a symposium, "We once believed justice was balance, but Serena showed us sometimes silence is the most brutal scale." National television re-aired summit segments. Who Did It uncut without music. Viewers stayed tuned for hours, not for entertainment, but to witness who would take responsibility, who would bow their head, who would admit the entire structure was leaking before Serena was even arrested. A veteran journalist exclaimed, "For the first time, we have a story where the main character didn't need to speak, didn't need to act, didn't need to win, yet still made the entire system look inward." And on the other side, the responses began to crack. Those who once celebrated Serena's arrest vanished from the media. Some deleted posts, some changed their tone, others fell silent as if they'd never laughed at her. But social media does not forget. One account that mocked her was traced to a workplace, where the employer, after reviewing the employee's full history, not only terminated them, but issued a public apology for hiring someone so unethical that it damaged the team's integrity. On a morning talk show, a host who once claimed Serena was just playing the victim was challenged on air by his co-host, "And what role are you playing? A man who thinks a woman's tears are PR tactics?" The question silenced the studio, and the hashtag #AskHimAgain trended to #1 within 30 minutes. Apologies began to pour out, but no one believed them. One journalist who wrote Serena victim or director was let go by the editorial board not for being wrong, but for intentionally skewing the truth. That article was later used as a case study at a national journalism summit, where discussions began about the media's role in shaping justice. Perhaps the most brutal moment came when cameras caught a council member who had mocked Serena during last year's hearing being confronted by a student at a university lecture. A young woman raised her hand and asked, "You said we need role models, but last year you mocked one. Does your inspiration mean, 'Don't make me uncomfortable'?" He couldn't continue the speech. That clip would later be cited as a prime example of the collapse of false credibility. But history does not erase, history remembers. Not who was humiliated, but who stayed silent when it happened. Old commentaries were dug up. Past hearings were clipped. The names of those who once said, "She's playing the victim now," appeared on hashtags demanding collusion investigations. Laughter once heard on late-night comedy shows turned into framed evidence of insensitivity in hundreds of rebuttal videos. A television producer had to cancel an entire new season after viewers discovered he had once blocked Serena from appearing on a show discussing systemic reform, claiming she wasn't entertaining enough. People began combing through every transcript, every recording, every gesture, and the silence of the past now rang louder than any current voice. Yet Serena still did not appear. She didn't need to, because every time her name was mentioned, no one asked, "Who is she?" They asked, "Why do we still need someone like her to make the system tremble?" That question remains unanswered, and perhaps there will never be a single answer, because the system wasn't flawed in one place. It was flawed in the very assumption that people like Serena are the exception, the lucky survivors, the unexpected victims who fought back, when in truth no one should need a Serena to survive. No one should need a badge of power just to walk out of an interrogation room as a human being. In the evening news broadcast, a young editor said something that made the entire studio fall silent. "She is not the answer. She is the question we've avoided for far too long." And in the corner of the screen, the ticker scrolled across quietly, steadily, like the bloodstream of a nation just realizing how accustomed it had become to being wrong. Next, nationwide legislative response expected. As the camera cut to another scene, the microphone remained on, and the audio technician inadvertently captured a sigh. Too late. But at least someone survived to tell the story. The sentence was recorded, clipped, and circulated as a short video that garnered millions of views, accompanied by thousands of piercing comments, not about Serena, but about those who once spoke out to dismiss her. A renowned director, who had once published an op-ed defending the necessity of doubt during Serena's arrest, was forced to step down from the National Arts Council after a wave of young actors signed a collective boycott, pushing him to issue a public statement in a short video that viewers described as an apology delivered with condescending eyes. Later, the man who coordinated the smear campaign against Serena on a major social media platform returned on live stream, only to be flooded with coffin emojis in the comments. He had to disable the chat and abruptly cut the stream because he could not continue speaking under the avalanche of backlash that grew exponentially by the minute. His career was pulled off life support in less than 48 hours, and the brands that had once sponsored him released statements one after another, declaring they were reevaluating the standards for media partnerships. But that was still not the biggest aftershock. A political advisor who had once sat on the hearing panel and who had publicly mocked Serena with syrupy sarcasm on national television was denounced by students from his own alma mater, who wrote a collective letter protesting his invitation as an honorary speaker. The letter, which spread widely across social media, contained the line, "We do not respect those who saw the silence of a wrongly arrested woman as an opportunity to showcase their intellect." When asked for his response, he simply muttered, "I didn't think the kids would remember for this long." But it is precisely because people remember that every word once spoken, whether a casual joke, a contemptuous glance, or laughter from a podium, now stands as evidence. An entertainment talk show that once made Serena's case the subject of jokes received an official notice from the Media Regulatory Agency demanding an explanation for content that inflicted harm on the community. The host was compelled to apologize publicly, but no one cared to listen because the public no longer wanted apologies. They wanted consequences. And yet, no matter how many new laws are passed, no matter how many media campaigns are launched, no matter how many reform promises are made, people know if the system does not change at its core, there will always be another Serena. And each new Serena will be colder, quieter, less in need of affection, only in need of survival. 1 month after the reform petition surpassed 5 million signatures, as the media began shifting focus to election campaigns, hashtags faded, and the once fiery calls for justice flickered out like spent candles in the night. A familiar door at the Department of Justice opened, without fanfare, without reporters, without ceremony. The person who walked in wore a light gray shirt, her hair neatly tied back, holding nothing but a thick fold. No cameras awaited, but those who were present in the hallway that day all paused in the same breath, because they had seen her before, not at award ceremonies, but at hearings, not as a victim, but as the shadow that made an entire system turn the mirror on itself. Serena returned to the DOJ office, where she had submitted her resignation exactly 365 days ago, citing medical leave, a carefully chosen phrase to disguise a decision born of rejection. That day she had left with a single sheet of paper, a box of personal belongings, no statement, and no farewell gathering. And today she returned with that same silence, unchanged in tone. There was no press conference, no reappointment video, no welcoming tweet from the communications office. Serena did not need the media to remember her. She only needed the systems to remember that she had never truly left their minds. And so, her first act, after scanning her badge at the entrance, was not to reclaim her old seat, but to authorize the reopening of every internal review case that had been closed 18 months prior. Cases buried under technical jargon, labeled lack of evidence, masked by phrases like standard procedure. Her return made those who once invoked the law feel their morning coffee tremble in their hands. On the internal forum, a former legal advisor who had signed off on closing those files when Serena resigned posted a calming message. "We've always followed protocol." But less than 2 hours later, someone posted a verbatim recording from the previous year, his voice scoffing during a closed meeting, saying, "Who remembers those petty cases anymore? The public's busy with social media drama now." The clip spread across Slack, was downloaded on Reddit, then screenshot and posted on Twitter with the cold caption, "The public forgets, the system remembers." At a well-known legal bar where DOJ officials often gathered on Friday nights, a former investigator walked in and immediately felt the stares. The bartender said nothing, didn't ask for his order, just wiped a glass dry and muttered, "That seat's reserved for someone who sits with a straight back." The words weren't loud, weren't cruel, but they were enough to make the man put his wallet back down and step away from the light. The internal security camera clip was leaked, cut precisely at the moment he froze for 3 seconds before turning away. The video needed no narration. It amassed millions of views, with a single comment repeated, "A century of sitting in the wrong seat, 3 seconds to realize it's time to stand up." On the DOJ intranet, a list titled "Cases Reopened by Direct Order" was leaked. The list was not long, but each name was a blade piercing the hearts of those who once believed. Back then, everyone did that. One name stood out: the chief inspector during the time Serena was arrested. Less than a day after the list went viral, the law firm where he worked as a consultant terminated his contract. No statement, no press release, but a leaked internal email was clear. Corporate clients no longer feel secure with personnel who once distorted the concept of suspicion. He vanished from LinkedIn, but within hours, a social media user spotted him alone at the airport, hat pulled low, dragging an old suitcase, eyes avoiding every camera. The caption said it all, without needing. Fleeing the system he once called home, smells like cleaning in progress. On the 8th floor conference room, where the department heads of reopened investigations were summoned in silence, one man, once deputy director of technical operations, spoke up during the meeting, trembling as he asked Serena, "How far will we investigate?" She did not look at him. She placed a slim, neat folder on the table and read each word. "We do not stop where you grow tired. We stop where truth no longer needs my voice to speak for it." No one responded. One man quietly removed the badge from his chest, set it down, and asked to withdraw from duty. But in the internal email that followed, Serena crossed his name onto the list of reopened investigations, not to dismiss, but to begin again. No one would escape by leaving early. The investigation chiefs entered that room as if stepping into a courtroom with no judge, no defense counsel, just one woman sitting at the head of the table, wearing no ID, offering no introduction, yet whose gaze rendered every justification obsolete. She didn't interrogate. She simply handed out a list, short, precise, cold as forged steel in winter. Each name on it was once marked case closed, but she knew, and they knew, that those weren't closures. They were paperwork scrubs of truths never washed by honesty. No one asked whether she had truly returned, because Serena's presence never depended on a title. It resided in the depths of her silence, the kind that made people afraid to lie in front of her. Serena did not interrogate. She did not threaten. She did not seek revenge. She simply cleaned house, like someone who wipes off dust not for aesthetics, but because she cannot bear the stench of rot. And that stench, after 365 days, had begun to rise from those who thought they had escaped. The former campaign director against civil dissent, who once called suppression strategic stabilization, was cornered when his name appeared on the review list. In a departmental meeting, when he stood to protest reopening the past, a young staffer at the back table quietly played an internal recording from the previous year, his voice laughing, clearly saying, "Now that she's gone, we can call white gray." The room froze. No one asked for clarification. No one needed further reason. And as he quietly stepped down from his seat, no one stopped him, not out of respect, but because no one wanted to sit near him anymore. In Serena's first week back, an anonymous account posted a surveillance video from the records archive, where part of the files tied to 3 suspended lawsuits had been destroyed. The person in the footage wasn't in uniform, but the gait, movements, and voice caught on internal radio were enough to identify him. The former IT team leader. He had once been praised for securing the system effectively. Now, after the video went viral, the security company he consulted for issued a termination notice within 48 hours. No press release, no explanations, just one line in their internal letter. "We do not collaborate with individuals who obscure retrieval orders." At a small laundromat on South Street, where the wife of a former judge who once worked with Serena came to pick up clothes, the shop owner, a woman of African descent, wrapped the coat in clean plastic, but refused the payment. She said, without looking up, "I don't charge for things that once sat in seats of law to ignore justice." The woman said nothing, simply took the coat and walked out quickly. But the act was captured, shared millions of times, with a single caption: "The silence of the wrongly judged now returns in every nod." At a legal symposium in Chicago, a professor who had once defended deterrent arrests was questioned by a student in the middle of his lecture. The student didn't raise his voice, didn't insult. He simply read the names of 4 victims who had been marked process correctly during the professor's advisory tenure at the DOJ, and then placed on the desk a handwritten letter from a mother whose child went missing after an interrogation last year. No one applauded, but a leaked audio recording from the symposium later showed that, following the event, the university launched an internal investigation into the professor's entire tenure, not out of outrage, but because they could no longer turn away, and so reports began to be retrieved. Audio files compressed on old hard drives were reopened. Civil lawsuits, thought to have faded away, were named again, not for attention, but for completion, because Serena didn't demand that the system apologize. She demanded that the system pay what was owed. The departments buzzed, not from fear, but from the understanding that this time, no one would be allowed to quietly disappear like Holloway. This time, every name that had used orders to choke the truth would be laid on the table, not to punish, but to peel back, layer by layer, signature by signature, margin note by margin note. No one was torn apart, just unmasked, because what Serena was cleaning wasn't trash, it was dust, the kind that clings for too long, thick and seemingly harmless, but is exactly what dims the light in courtrooms. Whispers spread about sudden, concise meetings, documents requested overnight, emails from Serena that never exceeded 3 lines, yet made entire departments stay up all night to respond on time. She didn't yell. She wasn't harsh, but everyone who had worked under her knew, even a single typo, she wouldn't bring it up again. The file would simply be redirected for cross-verification, and anyone under cross-verification knew they had landed in the sight line of someone who didn't need long to spot where the truth had been hidden. The atmosphere inside the DOJ began to shift in her first week back. A former case coordination team leader, who once bluntly stated during a meeting that Serena is only fit to be a symbol, was suddenly reassigned to the basement archive, not through disciplinary action, but under internal policy for reevaluating current capacity misalignment. But what turned the situation into office lore was the staff's reaction. No one said anything, no goodbyes. His desk was left bare, no flowers, no cards, not even a farewell coffee. A photograph of him shaking hands with the Deputy Attorney General last year was taken down from the bulletin board just 2 minutes after Serena walked onto that floor. A group of mid-level staff previously accused of altering internal memos to justify dismissing a civil suit were named in the email coordinating the re-audit, and since then, every meeting featured an empty chair in the middle of the room. No one dared sit in it. Some said it was pending reassignment. Others said it was the very seat Serena had used for 3 minutes during a technical meeting last year, and ever since then, every error tied to that group began to be revisited. The tension didn't feel like a purge. It came from her absence, her silent passing through the halls without a word, without a glance, yet making no one dare whisper aloud what they used to shout when she wasn't around. A former senior coordinator, who once ordered a police brutality case removed from the review list, was openly refused cooperation by younger staff. In a group meeting, as he tried to explain practical standards and assessments, a newly hired female analyst closed her laptop, pulled out her pen from her notebook, and said, "If you think practical means packaging truth in directives, maybe take a month off to relearn what the index of justice actually means." He froze. The meeting ended without discussion, but the audio recording leaked, subtitled, and shared millions of times under one hashtag: Truth has no budget, mode. A leaked emergency email from the Internal Legal Affairs Office revealed that within 48 hours of Serena signing the order to re-review last year's files, 6 senior legal advisors officially withdrew from the review panel, not because they were accused, but because they no longer felt morally positioned to defend against someone who doesn't need to speak to silence a room. At a diner near DOJ headquarters, one of them, previously famous for his firm and rational TV commentary, was spotted sitting alone by a window, staring at a resignation form. Someone took a discreet photo, no caption, just an image of a man who once believed he was unshakable, now quietly folding up the map of a system that no longer had space for power, based on semantics. The press tried to snap a picture of her in the office. None succeeded. Lawmakers wanted to invite her to testify. She declined. Civil groups offered to award her, refused. All the public ever saw was a single photo secretly taken by an anonymous staffer from the 4th floor, Serena standing alone in front of DOJ headquarters at 6 in the morning, just before the first rays of sunlight had a chance to illuminate the bronze nameplate. No escorts, no advisors, No one is opening a car door, just a thin woman standing still, as if the building itself were waiting for her to touch it and wake up from a long sleep. And as she stepped through the security gate, the guard, a veteran, who in 20 years of service had never remembered the name of a single department head, murmured a sentence even he didn't know why he said, "I don't know who she is, but I know I have to salute." The girl watched her mother through the frosted glass of the DOJ office, tall, upright, standing alone at the door like a period, needing no explanation. Serena did not turn around. She never needed to turn around to confirm she was being watched. She did not live to be seen, but to make others unable to look away. That was what her daughter had learned. Not from books, not from hollow moral lessons at school, but from an afternoon the previous year when her mother was pulled from the driver's seat, her face pressed against the car hood in broad daylight, and everyone around stood still, as if justice were operating correctly. The girl was only 8 years old then. Amid the blaring sirens and the shouts of uniformed men, she did not cry. She only opened her eyes wide, very wide, and memorized every face, every movement, every word. "You are being arrested for suspicious behavior." At that time, she did not understand what suspicious meant, but she understood very clearly no one should be treated that way in front of their child. That was the first lesson she etched into her heart. Not "my mother was wrongfully arrested," but "my mother did not bow her head, even when beaten. Even when dragged away, she still stood tall in my eyes." But what etched that memory most deeply was what happened afterward. When Chief Holloway was extradited back, instead of receiving a silent handshake from those who had once bowed to him, he descended the airplane stairs amid the jeers of a group of airport workers, none of whom were paid to do so, but none chose to remain silent any longer. A woman threw a shoe at him, missing, but enough to make him bend over for the first time, not out of authority, but out of shame. And when that image spread across social media, people did not tag it with justice. They simply wrote, "Kneeling out of shame, not respect." The very next morning, a local TV host, who had publicly defended Holloway, was cut off live after repeating the phrase, "reluctant law enforcer." Online, thousands flooded his personal page, not to insult, but to ask, "What would you think if your mother were the one pressed against the car hood?" And within less than 8 hours, he had to post a public apology video, eyes red, no longer using the show's name as a crutch, stammering out a sentence people were too weary to forgive. "I didn't look long enough, didn't think deeply enough." The climax came when a photojournalist who had captured Serena's moment of restraint the previous year and had sold that photo for $3,000 to a tabloid appeared at a justice-themed photography exhibition. As he raised his camera, a young student approached, said nothing, and held up a large print of that photo, crossed out in red ink, with the caption, "One does not sell pain to buy fame." The crowd did not push or shove. They simply turned their backs in unison. And that moment became one of the most shared images of the week, not for its artistic value, but for its simple message. Villains are no longer allowed to make themselves victims. A year later, everything changed, but not in the way people usually speak of change. Serena did not become a magazine hero. She did not grace newspaper covers, did not release a memoir, and did not participate in any staged interviews with flattering lighting. She did not need to write anything about herself, because her life, her silence, her decisiveness were languid, and her daughter, the only one who had ever heard the words, "Serena did not speak publicly," was the living witness to a kind of justice that required no speech. "Mom didn't teach me to fight them," the girl recounted at her school's year-end exhibition, where students were asked to draw the person they admired most. She stood before the class, holding a pastel drawing, not reading the prepared presentation. She simply said, calmly and clearly, Mom taught me to make sure they never have the chance to do that to anyone else again. A calmness sharp as a blade, and the entire room, from teachers to parents, suddenly fell silent. The girl's drawing did not have many colors. A gray background, black silhouettes surrounding a central figure, a woman holding no weapon, raising no hand, just standing, very straight, like a milestone that could not be toppled. The surrounding shadows were dissolving, dripping like oil under harsh sunlight, not because someone fought back, but because they could no longer maintain their form in the face of her silent presence. The girl did not title the drawing. She only wrote a small, slanted line in the lower right corner, Serena Monroe, Justice, unspoken. The principal was speechless upon seeing the drawing. The vice principal quietly placed a hand over her chest, not out of emotion, but out of helplessness in finding words to comfort a child who had witnessed her mother being handcuffed. And then, one by one, people stepped forward, saying nothing, just placing a hand on the girl's shoulder, not to encourage, but as an acknowledgement. They had stood on the wrong side for too long. Outside the school that day, a delivery truck was quietly parked by the curb. Behind the wheel sat a gray-hailed man, once the deputy chief of the city police department, who had signed the report asserting Serena was non-compliant during her arrest. Now he made a living delivering groceries, not forced, but no longer rehired. A day before the exhibition, he was denied service at a cafe that had once been a regular spot for law enforcement. The employee behind the counter said just one sentence, without raising their voice. "Here, we don't serve those who once signed off on silence." He did not react, just bowed his head and left. But that image of the wrinkled safety vest, the solitary face in a morning devoid of status, was captured by a student, posted online with a caption as cold as ice. "When justice arrives late, even breakfast has no place." A few days later, a national television broadcast left viewers breathless. A former federal police officer, who once led the team that arrested Serena, faced intense public backlash after appearing as a crime scene consultant on a reality show. Less than 3 minutes into the broadcast, the program received more than 17,000 protest comments, forcing the network to cut the live feed and return to the studio in silence. Online, people began recirculating an old video of him ordering a woman to be handcuffed while she begged to call her child, juxtaposed with footage of his dazed expression on camera that day. The caption, embedded in the video, read simply, "Tonight's spotlight isn't for you." Not long after, at a city job fair, he was spotted standing alone in the courtyard, wearing a white shirt, holding a recruitment sign for a private security firm. No one approached him. Passers-by whispered to one another, and a group of university students even stopped to take a selfie with him in the background, then posted it with the caption, "Behind me is the man who once said the system is always right. In front of me is the future saying, no, not anymore." The image spread like wildfire, not for its technical quality, but for the downcast gaze visible through his sunglasses, a look belonging to someone devoured by the very era he once ruled. In another development within the force itself, an internal vote to posthumously award former Chief Holloway the Medal of Honor met fierce opposition from younger staff. A leaked internal petition, bearing more than 300 signatures, began with the words, "We cannot honor a shadow that once eclipsed conscience." The press didn't need to do anything more than publish the letter verbatim. Its weight alone was enough to leave the system gasping. The former PR officer who had written speeches for Holloway was fired shortly after posting a cryptic message on LinkedIn, referencing what was right at the time. No one accepted excuses anymore. No one allowed that time to repeat itself. The media began calling Serena the woman who didn't need to strike back to make others bow. But she never accepted such titles. To her, justice was not a battle to be won. It was a room that needed to be scrubbed clean. Every stain, every trace, every damp stench of compromise. And if someone had to do that every day in silence, she was willing. Not for fame, but because her daughters, and all children, deserve to grow up in a world where stories like their mother's would only be told as a warning, never a pattern. A reporter once denied an interview by Serena spoke at a conference, "She doesn't seek revenge, she cleans the house." And that's what terrifies even the most powerful, because she doesn't need to fight to win. She just stands in the right place at the right time, and every lie dissolves before her. The audience didn't applaud, they only looked at one another, as if realizing they too had once been part of that room. The room Serena had cleansed, not with words, but with a presence so undeniable that no one could deny the truth anymore. And from that moment on, her presence triggered aftershocks. A conference on law enforcement integrity, organized by Holloway's former advisory group, was canceled on its first day when the keynote speaker, a retired officer who had defended the firm's approach toward Serena, took the stage and the entire auditorium stood and turned their backs on him. No shouting, no disruption, just silence, choreographed like a verdict. A clip of the moment went viral under the title, "No handcuffs needed, just turn your back." Within 2 hours, he was removed from 3 boards of directors, not for political dissent, but for lacking the moral credibility to teach anything at all. At a restaurant in Alexandria, the man who had signed the arrest warrant for Serena, after months of evading media, was spotted having a late dinner with his family. When a waiter recognized him, he paused for a few seconds, then firmly closed his notepad, looked him in the eye, and said, "Sorry, the kitchen is out of meals for those out of conscience." There were no screams. But in a leaked surveillance video, his wife's face turned pale, and the 2 children, not understanding, simply knew dinner was over. The clip needed no subtitles. Each share carried just one icon, an inverted scale of justice. At a police academy in a neighboring state, Holloway's portrait in the Memorial Hall was covered with a photocopy of a New York Times article. The man who signed the arrest of an innocent woman now lives under an arrest order bearing his own name. The portrait wasn't torn. No ink was spilled. They left it intact. Just pinned a single tack right at his forehead, once called the forehead of reason. And during that morning's lecture, a veteran instructor turned to the students, pointed to the wall, and said, "From now on, remember, not everyone whose name is in the manual deserves to be quoted." No one responded. But after class, 14 students simultaneously submitted requests to change their thesis topics, all writing the same phrase under research objectives: the impact of silence at the right time. The ripple didn't stop at schools. A major insurance firm that had provided legal coverage for the entire chain of events was now being boycotted en masse by customers, its stock price dropping for 3 consecutive days, forcing the communications director to issue a public apology on air for their non-arbitrary approval process. But during that live stream, a disruption occurred. Thousands of comments flooded in, all repeating the same question until the feed choked. What if she hadn't been Serena? No one could answer, because everyone knew the issue was never identity, but the truth that had been suppressed and sold. The story didn't end with a conclusion, but with an image. Serena walking down the DOJ hallway at 6:30 in the evening, sunlight slanting through the tall window panes. Her hands held nothing but a closed file. Her eyes met no camera. Her shadow stretched across the wall, long, thin, and silent, like a cut across the velvet backdrop of a system that once believed it was impenetrable. And in a small classroom in the suburbs, when little Monroe was asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" she didn't answer right away. She simply smiled, held up an old, worn drawing, and raised it. No words were needed, because her generation already understood. Sometimes, justice doesn't begin with a shout. It begins with those who were struck, but still stood tall, so those who once bowed to do wrong would have nowhere left to hide. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Each story told here is not just a script, it's a heartbeat, a lived experience, an effort to reach the hearts of those who are surviving, struggling, and searching for light amidst the shadows of life. Please leave a comment below. Share your own story, because sometimes a sincere word from you can give someone else the strength to keep going. Every like, every share, every subscription isn't just a number. It's a signal to let me know you're there, you're supporting, and you want to hear more truths, more strength, more honesty. I make these videos not to chase fame, but to create a small sanctuary where people have the right to speak of what's right, what's beautiful, and what must change. There are many more stories waiting to be told, to be heard, and your presence is the reason they will be.